At 11:47 p.m., every steel door inside one of the most secure facilities in the country unlocked itself. Not because anyone in the command center ordered it, not because the system failed, but because a man they fired in front of his daughter had quietly built a conscience into the machine years before anyone thought to stop him. Victor Kane stood at the control panel watching screens flash white, shouting override commands that the building simply ignored. The system remembered who actually built it, and tonight it had decided whose orders it would follow. If you want to find out how one man's quiet act of engineering saved dozens of lives and dismantled a corrupt empire from the inside, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The morning they fired Ethan Mercer, it was raining in that particular mid-October way that doesn't commit to anything. Not cold enough to be dramatic, not warm enough to be comfortable. Just gray, persistent. The kind of rain that soaks through your jacket collar while you're still telling yourself it might stop soon. Ethan had known something was coming. He'd felt it building for weeks the way you feel a headache before it arrives. A pressure behind the eyes, a thickness in the air around certain conversations. The specific silence that falls when you walk into a room where people were just talking about you. He knew. He just hadn't told Lily. That had been the miscalculation. She was 9 years old and she'd asked to come see where her father worked, and Ethan had said yes because he thought maybe seeing the place would help her understand why he came home tired most nights. Why he sometimes sat at the kitchen table long after dinner with papers spread in front of him and a pen he'd been holding for 20 minutes without writing anything. She wanted to understand his world. He'd thought that was a good thing. She was wearing her yellow raincoat, the one with the broken zipper she refused to let him replace because she'd decorated the collar with iron-on patches of cartoon animals. And she was holding his hand as they crossed the parking lot toward the main entrance of Black Mesa Dynamics. The building itself was the kind of structure that architects designed to communicate power before you were even close enough to read the signage. 12 stories of dark glass and precision-cut concrete set back from the road at the end of a long approach that forced you to walk toward it for a full 2 minutes before you reached the entrance. Every foot of that walk was intentional. You were supposed to feel small by the time you arrived. Ethan had worked there for 11 years. He'd stopped feeling small around year 3. "It's bigger than I thought," Lily said. "It looks bigger than it is from the outside." "Is that true, or are you just saying that?" He looked down at her. Little of both. She seemed to accept that. She had a way of accepting things that weren't complete answers, which was both a gift and occasionally a source of guilt. She'd inherited some of her mother's patience, or maybe she'd developed it the way kids develop things when one parent raises them alone, by learning early that some questions don't resolve quickly. Her mother had left when Lily was 4, not dramatically, not in the middle of a fight with slammed doors and accusations, just gradually, and then not there. Ethan had never said anything bad about her to Lily, which was one of the few things he was completely certain he'd handled correctly. He badged them through the secondary entrance rather than the main lobby, partly because the main lobby was always full of people he'd have to acknowledge, and partly because the secondary entrance ran them past the mechanical floor where his actual work lived, the guts of the building, the conduit runs and relay panels, and the retrofit junction boxes he'd spec'd himself when the original contractor had tried to save money with undersized hardware. He liked showing Lily the real parts of things. "That's the primary distribution panel," he said, pointing through a wire glass window at a wall of gray metal cabinets with LED status indicators running in columns. "What does it do?" "Controls what goes where. Power, signals, commands. When someone up on the executive floor tells a door to lock, that panel is part of how the message gets there." Lily pressed her nose against the glass. "Does it ever make mistakes?" Ethan almost said no automatically, then caught himself. "The panel doesn't, but the people who program it do." "Have you ever made a mistake?" "Yeah," he said. "A few." He didn't elaborate and she didn't push. They took the service elevator up to the 3rd floor where Ethan's desk sat in a long room alongside 7 other senior technicians' workstations. The space was utilitarian in the way that rooms get when engineers are left to their own preferences. Important things carefully organized, aesthetic things entirely abandoned. Cable management was immaculate. The wall calendar was 2 months behind. Someone had taped a schematic above their monitor so long ago The tape had yellowed and the edges of the paper had curled. His colleagues nodded at Lily with the slightly uncomfortable warmth that adults who don't spend much time around children offer, genuine but uncertain. Marcus Webb, who sat closest to Ethan's station, rolled his chair back and extended a hand to Lily with formal seriousness. "Marcus Webb," he said, "I've heard a lot about you." Lily shook his hand with equal gravity. "What did you hear?" "That you make excellent drawings." He nodded toward Ethan's monitor, where a drawing was taped below eye level. A building with simple rectangular doors, each one open, with small stick figures walking through them in both directions. Lily had given it to him 6 months ago. He'd put it up the same day. Lily examined it critically. "I drew that a long time ago. I'm better now." "What would you draw differently?" She thought about it. "More people, and I'd make the doors bigger." Marcus nodded like this was useful technical feedback. "Makes sense." Ethan had settled into his chair and was pulling up the morning's fault logs when the call came from Sheila at the front desk. Not through his desk phone, but on his cell, which Sheila only used when she needed to tell him something she didn't want on the internal system. He looked at the screen, felt the pressure behind his eyes tighten, and stood up. "Hey, Lil, can you stay with Marcus for a few minutes?" She was already looking at the fault log display on Marcus's secondary monitor with obvious interest. "What is all that?" "Error codes," Marcus said. "Want me to tell you what they mean?" "Yeah." Ethan stepped into the hallway. Sheila's voice on the phone was careful in the way people get when they're trying to communicate something without saying it. "There's a meeting in the 4th floor conference room. Victor asked me to let you know." "When?" "Now, Ethan." He stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone at his side. Down the corridor, one of the overhead fluorescent fixtures was cycling slightly. Not a full flicker, just a micro variation in output that you'd only notice if you'd been looking at artificial light in enclosed spaces for over a decade. He'd filed a maintenance note on that fixture 3 weeks ago. It hadn't been addressed. He put the phone back in his pocket and went to the conference room. Victor Kane had been security chief at Black Mesa for 6 years, which was long enough to have developed a complete theory of how organizations worked, and short enough that his theory was still largely untested against serious adversity. He was 51, lean in the deliberate way of men who take their physical condition as evidence of character, and he had the specific kind of confidence that comes not from having done many difficult things well, but from having spent years in rooms where no one challenged him. He was standing at the head of the conference table when Ethan arrived. Rebecca Holloway, the CEO, sat to his left. Ethan didn't know the other 3 people in the room. 2 of them had the look of corporate legal, and the third was from HR, a woman named Carla Symes, who Ethan had spoken to exactly twice before, neither time about anything good. There was no preamble. "We're ending your employment," Victor said, "effective today." Ethan sat down without being invited to, which seemed to briefly irritate Victor. "On what basis?" "Insubordination, repeated failure to follow protocols for internal reporting, circumventing established chain-of-command procedures." Victor slid a folder across the table. "It's all documented." Ethan didn't open the folder. "The protocols I circumvented required me to route safety concerns through a chain of command where you're the third link. The concerns I raised were about the system you're responsible for. You understand why that's a structural problem." "What I understand," Victor said, "is that you've spent the last 8 months undermining your department's leadership, filing reports with external contacts without authorization, and generally conducting yourself as though the rules of this organization don't apply to you when you disagree with them." Rebecca Holloway spoke for the first time. She had a measured quality to her voice that Ethan had always found difficult to read. It could mean she was being careful, or it could mean she'd already decided and was now performing deliberation. "Ethan, we've taken your concerns seriously. We reviewed your reports. And our engineering team is satisfied that the system meets all applicable safety standards." Your engineering team reviewed a version of the system documentation that Victor's office provided to them. A pause. Carla Symes shifted in her chair. "That's a significant accusation," Rebecca said. "I know, I have documentation." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded set of papers, Not the full file, which was elsewhere, but enough to make the point. The variance reports from April through August. The revision timestamps on the emergency protocol specs. The difference between what was submitted to your engineering team and what's actually installed in the building. Victor's expression didn't change, which told Ethan more than any change would have. Rebecca looked at the papers without taking them. Our legal team will need to review. You're going to fire me and then review the papers I just handed you? Ethan, her voice sharpened slightly. You have a pattern of, look, honestly, this has been coming for a long time. You're brilliant at what you do. No one disputes that. But you've become so invested in a particular outcome that you've lost perspective on how to work within a structure. The structure is the problem. That's exactly what I mean. He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, trying to find something there beyond the careful composure. He'd believed for a long time that Rebecca Holloway was a fundamentally decent person navigating a complicated position. He still half believed it, but half belief doesn't open doors. Okay, he said. He stood up. I'll clean out my desk. Victor's expression shifted then, not to satisfaction exactly, but something adjacent to it. Relief, maybe. The relief of a man who'd been braced for a fight that didn't come. What none of them anticipated was Lily. Ethan had assumed he'd be able to get to the third floor, say something brief and calm to Marcus, collect his things, and get his daughter out of the building without incident. It was a reasonable assumption. It failed because Victor Kane, for reasons that were probably more about staging than necessity, chose to have security escort Ethan out, and chose to do it personally. Two of Victor's people met Ethan at his workstation. They were professional about it, which somehow made it worse. Lily looked up from the schematic she'd been studying with Marcus, looked at the security officers, looked at her father, and in the way of a 9-year-old who is smarter than the adults around her fully account for, understood immediately that something was wrong. Dad? It's okay, Lil. We're going to head out. Marcus stood up from his chair. He didn't say anything. His jaw was tight. Ethan's belongings fit in a single cardboard box. 11 years. A power calculation notebook, 3 pencils, a coffee mug Lily had painted at one of those ceramic studios when she was 6, a spare charger, the small framed photo of Lily at the beach that had lived in the upper right corner of his monitor. Lily's drawing, the one with the open doors. He reached up and carefully peeled the tape from the corners of the drawing. He folded it once, gently, and set it on top of everything else. They walked him out through the main lobby rather than the side entrance. Ethan understood the choice. The main lobby had glass walls visible from the street. It had a high ceiling that made sounds carry. It had foot traffic. Victor was already in the lobby when they arrived. He was standing with 2 other executives whose names Ethan knew, but whose faces he was having trouble fully registering. There was a particular set to Victor's posture, loose, hands in his jacket pockets, weight back on his heels. That was a deliberate performance of ease. A man so unconcerned he barely needed to be present for this. Ethan, Victor said. Conversational. Like they were running into each other at lunch. Ethan kept walking. Lily's hand was in his. You know what your problem was? Victor continued, loud enough that the lobby's acoustics caught it. 3 or 4 people near the reception desk had stopped moving. You built things like they were yours, like you were the only one who understood them. That's a dangerous way for a technician to think. Ethan stopped. He turned. He wasn't sure later exactly why he stopped. Whether he'd planned to say something specific, or whether his body simply responded to the particular tone of the word technician, deployed like that, in that context. Victor was looking at him with an expression that had found its comfort. This was the part he'd been waiting for, the departure, the punctuation mark on his version of events. You kept filing reports nobody asked for, Victor continued, kept raising alarms nobody shared. You know what that looks like from the outside? It looks like a man who can't let go, can't admit the work moved on without him. He tilted his head slightly. We built something extraordinary here, Ethan, and we did it without needing your approval. The lobby was quiet. Lily was looking at Victor, not with fear, with something more uncomfortable than fear. She was looking at him the way children look at things that don't make sense yet, cataloging it, filing it somewhere. Ethan said, when the system fails, it won't. When it fails, Ethan said again, evenly, people are going to be underground and the doors are going to be sealed, and there won't be a manual override because you cut it from the budget in the third revision. The people trapped down there aren't going to care about the demonstration schedule or the federal contract or your performance review. He paused. I hope I'm wrong. I've been hoping that for 8 months. Victor smiled, not warmly. You're not wrong because you're right about the engineering, Ethan. You're wrong because you never understood what this company is actually building. It's not just a security system. It's a demonstration of capability. It's a statement, and statements require confidence. He glanced down at Lily, then back up. Get him out. The security officers were already moving. Ethan didn't resist. He walked through the main doors, through the wide glass threshold that opened with its smooth, well-maintained hydraulic hiss, and out into the gray October rain. Lily walked beside him without speaking. At the edge of the parking lot, just before they reached his car, she said, Why was he doing that? Ethan set the cardboard box on the trunk of his car. He looked back at the building, at its dark glass face, which reflected the cloudy sky back at you and told you nothing about what was inside. Because he needed to feel like he won, Ethan said. Did he? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Today he did. Lily processed this. She reached into the cardboard box and carefully lifted her drawing. The building with all its doors open, stick figures moving freely in both directions. She looked at it, then looked back at the building. Your doors are still in there, right? She said. The ones you designed. Yeah, Lil, they're still there. So they can't really erase you. She said it like a statement, not a question, like she'd done the math and arrived at a logical conclusion. Ethan didn't answer right away. He opened the passenger door for her, waited until she'd climbed in, then walked around to the driver's side and sat behind the wheel in the quiet of the car, with rain tapping the roof in small, irregular rhythms. He thought about the emergency protocol, the one he'd spent 4 months building into the deepest layer of the system's architecture. Below the security framework, below Victor's administrative access, coded to a fail-safe trigger that would activate automatically under specific compound failure conditions. He'd designed it to be invisible under normal operation and unkillable under abnormal operation. He designed it because he believed that any system controlling human access to underground spaces needed a conscience built into its bones, not added as an afterthought in a policy memo. Victor had found the surface version of it, stripped the visible components, and reattributed the underlying logic as part of a broader system resilience framework credited to the engineering department collectively, which in practice meant credited to Victor since he signed off on all collective department outputs. But you can't remove something from a system you don't fully understand. You can only remove what you can see. Ethan had built some things to be very difficult to see. He put the car in reverse and backed out of the parking space. Dad? Lily said. Yeah. I'm hungry. He exhaled. Not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. Okay, what do you want? Pancakes. It's 11 in the morning. Pancakes are appropriate at 11. He pulled out of the Black Mesa Dynamics parking lot, for what he believed was the last time, turned left onto the access road, and drove toward breakfast with his daughter and a cardboard box of 11 years in the back seat. The pancake place they went to was a diner 3 miles from the facility. A genuine old diner, not a reconstructed version of one, with vinyl booth seats that had been repaired so many times the repair patches had their own repair patches, and a laminated menu with photographs that didn't quite match what arrived on the plates. Ethan had been coming here since his 3rd month at Black Mesa. He knew which booths had the best light and which ones were close enough to the kitchen that you got your food fast but smelled like fryer oil when you left. He took the booth by the window. Lily ordered pancakes with strawberries. He ordered coffee and eggs he didn't particularly want, and stared at the rain working its way down the diner window in competing rivulets. Are you going to get a different job? Lily asked. Eventually. When? I don't know yet. She cut her pancakes with the focused attention she brought to things she considered worth doing carefully. Will you be home more? For a while, probably. Yeah. She didn't say anything to that, but something in her posture shifted slightly, not dramatically, not in a way she might have been aware of, just a small reduction in the tension she carried between her shoulder blades. He noticed it and felt, simultaneously, glad and guilty about it. "Marcus seemed sad," she said. "Marcus is good people." "Why didn't he say anything when the security guys came?" Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "Because he has a mortgage and a kid in high school, and he's 4 years from the retirement tier that makes the pension decent. He said everything he could afford to say by standing up." Lily considered this with the unflinching honesty of a child who hasn't yet internalized the adult habit of softening true things. "That's sad." "Yeah, it is." "Is that what happened to you? You said things you couldn't afford to say?" "I said things I couldn't afford not to say. Different problem." She looked at him. "Is that better or worse?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet." The rain had gotten slightly heavier. Through the diner window, the Black Mesa building was invisible, too far away, hidden by a low ridge in the gray October murk. But Ethan was aware of it the way you're sometimes aware of things that aren't visible, a particular weight in a particular direction. He thought about the federal demonstration, scheduled for November. He thought about the maintenance logs he'd been tracking in his own notebooks for the past year, the air handling discrepancies on sub-level 2, the power relay fluctuations in the eastern mechanical corridor, the slow pressure variance in the hydraulic lines that serve the blast doors on levels 3 through 5. None of it was catastrophic in isolation. Together, under the right conditions, it painted a specific kind of picture. He'd submitted those logs with his final report, the report that Rebecca had handed to the engineering team that had reviewed the documentation Victor's office provided. He took a sip of coffee that had gone slightly cold while he was thinking. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah." She was holding her fork midway between her plate and her mouth, looking at him with an expression he recognized, the look she got when she was about to say something she'd been working up to. "You're not done with it, are you?" It wasn't quite a question. "No," he said. "Not quite." "Okay." She put the fork down and pushed her plate toward him. "Try the pancakes. They're actually really good." He cut off a piece and ate it. She was right. They were good. Real butter, not the substitute, and the strawberries were fresh, not from a can. "That's good," he said. "I told you." They sat in the diner while the rain did what it was going to do, and Ethan drank his cold coffee, and Lily told him about the error code she'd been reading on Marcus's secondary monitor, a recurring fault on sub-level 5, something about a door relay handshake failure that kept resolving itself and coming back every 6 to 8 hours. She'd memorized the code number because she found it interesting. He went very still when she told him the code number. Sub-level 5, Eastern Corridor, hydraulic relay, the exact relay sequence he'd flagged in August. "Where did you see that?" he said carefully. "On the screen. I asked Marcus what it meant, and he said it was a recurring calibration issue, and they'd been meaning to get someone down there to look at it." She picked up her fork again. "He said it had been coming up for about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And no one had sent anyone down there." Ethan looked at the window. The rain was heavier now, running in sheets. In his chest, something settled. Not peace exactly, and not satisfaction, because what he felt wasn't any flavor of good feeling. It was more like the moment when a set of numbers you've been staring at finally resolves into the answer you were afraid was there all along. He pulled out his phone, opened the notebook app where he kept the technical logs, started a new entry. Sub-L 5 Eastern Corridor relay fault, 6 weeks persistent, unaddressed. Hydraulic sequence involvement confirmed via secondary monitor observation. Cross-reference August maintenance submission, items 7 through 12. He put the phone face down on the table. "Are you writing it down?" Lily asked. "Yeah." "Good." She went back to her pancakes. "You should always write down the things that matter." He looked at her, her yellow rain jacket hanging on the booth hook behind her, the small patches of cartoon animals along the collar, the particular quality of attention she brought to her food that she brought to everything she found worth her time. He thought, "I don't know who taught you that, but I'm glad you know it." He didn't say it out loud. Some things you just carry. Chut. The weeks after the firing were quieter than he expected. He'd braced for the particular chaos of sudden unemployment, The financial anxiety, the loss of structure, the way that days can spread out in front of you like something you don't quite know how to fill when the routine that shaped them is gone. Some of that happened, but less than he'd feared. He drove Lily to school. He picked her up. He made dinner at a reasonable hour instead of reheating whatever he'd assembled at 10 p.m. after she was already asleep. He went to her parent-teacher conference and actually listened during the whole thing instead of reading maintenance specs on his phone under the table. He also kept his notebooks. Old habits are stubborn, and for 11 years his habit had been to document everything. Not obsessively, not in the way that tips over into paranoia, but with the steady discipline of someone who understood that systems are political objects as much as technical ones, and that the truth of what a system does is often different from the story told about it. He'd kept parallel records for 3 years. Personal backups of every report he'd filed, every fault log he'd accessed, every revision timestamp that told a story different from the official one. The files lived on a hardware-encrypted drive in a fireproof lockbox in his home office closet, behind a box of Lily's old school projects he'd never gotten around to sorting. He didn't do anything with them immediately. He thought about going to a journalist, and didn't. He thought about filing a complaint with the relevant regulatory bodies, and drafted one, and then put it in a folder and looked at it for 2 weeks without sending it, not because he'd lost his nerve. It was more that he'd spent a long time being the person who shouted warnings into rooms that weren't listening, and he'd come to understand that timing matters as much as truth. The right information at the wrong moment is just noise. He was waiting for something, though he couldn't have said precisely what. He got calls from 2 former colleagues. Marcus was one of them, always late at night, kept his voice low, said nothing specific but managed to communicate that the relay fault on sublevel 5 had not been addressed, that there were now 2 additional fault codes showing in the eastern corridor, and that the November demonstration schedule had not moved. He didn't editorialize. He just reported facts. Ethan thanked him and wrote everything down. The second call was from a woman named Diane Chen, who'd been on the fire suppression systems team before being reassigned 6 months before Ethan left. She didn't work at Black Mesa anymore. She'd taken a job at a municipal engineering firm outside the city. And she called him once, late on a Thursday, and said, "I just wanted you to know I kept copies of the air handling reports from sublevel 2. In case it ever matters." "Thank you, Diane." "I hope it never matters." "Me too." After he hung up, he sat in the kitchen with the lights off for a while, thinking about the specific architecture of what he'd built into the system 3 years ago. The emergency protocol wasn't a single thing. It was a layered conditional structure, a decision tree that would only activate under simultaneous compound failure conditions. Power anomaly, plus door system failure, plus manual override absence, plus a time-based dead man switch that required active confirmation from the system's primary author every 180 days. He hadn't confirmed the switch since August. His authorization had lapsed in October, 2 weeks after he'd been walked out of the building. When the 180-day window expired without confirmation, the protocol would shift into a passive monitor mode. And if the monitor mode detected the specific compound failure conditions within 90 days of the expiration, if the door system, the power grid, and the manual override all failed in the same window, the protocol would go active on its own. He'd built it that way specifically because he'd imagined a scenario in which the person who built the system was no longer there to confirm it. He sat with that thought in the dark kitchen for a while. The federal demonstration was scheduled for the second week of November. He'd checked. It was public knowledge, mentioned in a regional business publication as part of a story about Black Mesa's contract pipeline. That was 5 weeks away. His 90-day passive window closed on November 14th. Ethan got up, turned the kitchen light on, and made himself a cup of tea he didn't particularly want because sometimes you need something to do with your hands while you're thinking through implications. The implications took a while. He sat with them until Lily's alarm went off upstairs at 7, and then he heard her moving around above him. The particular sequence of her morning sounds, bathroom, dresser, the specific way she bounced down the last 2 stairs, and he put the implications aside and made her breakfast. Some things you just have to let arrive in their own time. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a lighthouse, Lily had taped a new drawing she'd done the week before. A building, like the old one, but more detailed now. She'd gotten better. She was right about that. The doors were larger, more carefully rendered. She'd drawn the hinges. She'd drawn the handles, the way they angled just slightly, the way a hand would naturally find them. And every door was open, every single one. 3 years before Victor Kane escorted him out of the building, Ethan Mercer had sat in a room he wasn't supposed to be in, reading a document nobody had sent him. The room was a decommissioned server space on sub-level 3. Small, cold, smelling of old electronics and the particular staleness of spaces that don't get enough airflow. He'd been down there to run a diagnostic on the conduit pathways that fed the new security backbone, and he'd found the room unlocked, which it shouldn't have been, and inside it he'd found a terminal still logged into an active session, which it also shouldn't have been. He should have logged the access anomaly and left. Instead, he sat down. The document on the screen was a revision log for the emergency protocol architecture. Specifically, the humanitarian override system that Ethan had spent 4 months designing and submitting through proper channels 8 weeks earlier. He'd built it carefully, painstakingly, the way he built everything important, from the ground up, thinking about failure modes before features, thinking about the person trapped in the stairwell before thinking about the executive in the command center. The protocol was structured to prioritize human extraction over facility lockdown in compound emergency conditions. It was, in his professional assessment, the most important thing he'd ever engineered. What the revision log showed him in the cold server room on sub-level 3 was that the protocol had been substantially restructured in a revision cycle he hadn't been included in. The humanitarian trigger conditions had been altered. The automatic life safety override had been reclassified as a manual authorization function, requiring sign-off from the security chief before activation. The underlying logic was still there. His logic, his architecture, his decision tree, but what had been an automatic conscience had been converted into an optional one, and the revision was attributed to Victor Kane's office. Ethan sat in that room for 11 minutes. He knew because he checked the time when he sat down, and again when he stood up, and the interval felt important in a way he couldn't quite articulate. 11 minutes to understand what had happened and what it meant and what he was going to do about it. He took photographs of the screen with his phone. He locked the room behind him when he left, which it should have been to begin with. He filed his first formal objection the following morning. The objection went to his direct supervisor, a competent and perpetually harassed man named Don Price, who managed the systems integration team with the energy of someone running slightly faster than his own capacity. Don read the objection, read it again, and then looked at Ethan across his desk with the expression of a man who has just been handed a problem he didn't budget time for. You're saying Victor's office changed your protocol without telling you? Without including me in the revision cycle, yes. And the change matters. The change converts an automatic life safety function into a discretionary one. Yes, it matters. If there's a compound failure event and the security chief is unavailable, incapacitated, and I want you to consider this seriously, Don. If the security chief's judgment is compromised by institutional pressure during an incident, the protocol will not activate without his sign-off. Don turned a pen over in his fingers. That's a significant accusation about Victor's intentions. I'm not accusing him of anything. I'm describing a structural problem in the system architecture. The intentions are irrelevant to the engineering concern. They're not irrelevant to how this gets handled. Ethan looked at him. I know. Don filed the objection upward. It came back 2 weeks later with a response from Victor's office indicating that the revision had been made to meet federal security compliance requirements and had been reviewed and approved by the appropriate authorities. The response did not name the authorities. It did not provide documentation of the review. It was, as a piece of formal communication, technically complete and substantively hollow. Ethan filed a follow-up request for the compliance documentation. The documentation arrived 6 weeks later and was, upon close reading, documentation for a different system in a different facility operated by a different contractor. The reference numbers had been updated to match Black Mesa's project identifiers, but the underlying specs described a surface-level facility with different failure mode characteristics and no underground operational zones. Ethan documented this discrepancy in a 12-page report with exhibits and submitted it to Don, to the facilities director, and to Rebecca Holloway's executive office. Rebecca's office acknowledged receipt. Don called him into his office 3 days later and closed the door, which Don rarely did. Ethan, I want to talk to you straight. Okay. You're right about the documentation. Don said it quietly, like the room might be paying attention. I went through it myself. The compliance reference doesn't hold up for an underground facility. I know. But here's where I need you to hear me. Don leaned forward on his desk. He was a few years older than Ethan, heavier, with the look of someone who'd been navigating institutional complexity long enough to have developed a realistic view of what it costs. Victor has Rebecca's ear. He has had it since the Kessler contract came in, because that contract is the reason the company doubled its government pipeline in 18 months, and Victor is the one who secured it. That's the reality. I understand the reality. Do you? Because what you're doing, what these reports are, they're going to get read as an attack on Victor's work. That's how they'll be framed, not as a technical concern, as a personal campaign. I can't control how they're framed. You can control how often you file them. Ethan looked at Don for a long moment. Are you asking me to stop? Don looked uncomfortable. I'm asking you to think about what you're actually going to accomplish. Best case, they commission another review that comes back with the same answer. Worst case, you spend whatever credibility you have and nothing changes. And if there's an incident, then we deal with it. With what? The manual override that requires Victor's authorization? Ethan shook his head. Don, people could be underground, workers, maintenance crews. We run 3-shift coverage on sublevels 2 through 5. At any given time, there are 12 to 20 people below grade. If the blast doors seal in a Power Plus system failure scenario, they need an automatic extraction protocol, not a call to Victor. Don was quiet. You know I'm right, Ethan said. I know you might be right. Don straightened in his chair. Which is different. He filed the report anyway. And then another one in March when the first power relay anomalies started showing up in the sub-level 5 corridor, and another in May after he traced a hydraulic pressure variance back to a supply line that had been spec'd at 80% of recommended capacity during the budget revision, in which Victor's office had also cut the manual override infrastructure. The reports accumulated. The responses became shorter. The gap between submission and acknowledgement grew. By June, Rebecca Holloway had stopped acknowledging them directly and routed all response through a junior compliance coordinator who sent templated replies. By August, Ethan had begun keeping his parallel records. What he hadn't told Don, what he hadn't told anyone, was what he'd done in February. 6 months before the firing, in the quiet space between a late diagnostic run and midnight, when the sub-level corridors were empty and the building ran on its skeleton crew of overnight operators. He'd gone back to the core of the system. Not the surface layers, the policy layer, the administrative access layer where Victor's revisions lived. Deeper than that. The foundational architecture, the base code layer where the system's logic was first laid down. Below the levels that normal administrative access could reach. He'd built the system from the bottom up, which meant he knew where the bottom was. He also knew that in enterprise security systems of this generation, the administrative access logs were thorough at the top and thin at the foundation, the assumption being that only the manufacturer's engineers would ever need to work at the base layer, and that documentation requirements were therefore minimal. He wrote the emergency protocol into the foundation, not the revised version, the original. His original, the automatic humanitarian override, the compound failure trigger, the life safety decision tree that chose human extraction over facility lockdown without waiting for anyone's authorization. He coded it in a language register slightly different from the system's standard profile, which would make it difficult to find for anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. He embedded it below the security framework's readable surface, in the operational logic layer that ran under everything else, the layer that the building needed to function at all. He added one modification he hadn't included in the original, the dead man's switch. A 180-day confirmation window keyed to his own authorization credentials that would keep the protocol in a passive standby mode during normal operation. If he confirmed within the window, the protocol stayed passive, invisible, dormant, causing nothing. If he failed to confirm, if he was no longer there to confirm, the protocol would shift into monitor mode for 90 days, watching for the compound failure conditions. And if those conditions emerged within the 90-day window, The protocol would activate automatically, without authorization from anyone. It was not something he'd been asked to do. It was not something he'd received approval for. It was, depending on how you characterized it, either an act of profound professional responsibility or a significant overreach. And he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it could be read as both simultaneously. He thought about it from every angle he could manage, sitting in the cold of the sub-level corridor at 11 p.m. with the building humming its low background frequency around him. He thought about the 12 to 20 people working below grade on any given shift. He thought about Victor's manual override requirement. He thought about Dawn's face when he said, "Then we deal with it." He finished the code. He ran the verification tests against a sandbox environment on a separate drive. He confirmed the logic 3 times. And then he implemented it, and he documented it in his personal records in enough detail that someone who understood systems could follow it. And he locked the documentation in the fireproof box in his home office closet behind Lily's school projects. And he did not tell anyone. Some things you build for the future, and then you wait. October became November, and the air lost the last of its pretense about autumn. Ethan drove Lily to school in the mornings and listened to her talk about her friends and her teacher and the book she was reading and the ongoing drama of who had said what to whom during the lunch that week, and he was genuinely present for it in a way that his old schedule hadn't always allowed. That part was real. But in the evenings, after Lily was in bed and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, he worked. He had the technical documentation spread across the kitchen table and the living room floor in an order that made sense to him. Fault logs on the left, revision histories in the center, the compliance documentation, and its discrepancies stacked to the right. He'd started building what he thought of as a case file, though he hadn't decided yet what to do with it. More precisely, he knew what to do with it, had known for some time, but the decision of when and how carried enough weight that he was still turning it over. Marcus called on a Wednesday night in early November, a week before the demonstration. "You watching the weather?" Marcus said, which was not about weather. "Tell me." Sub-level 5 Eastern Corridor. The relay fault's been flagging twice a shift for the past 10 days. Somebody put in a work order. Work order got bumped because the demonstration prep is using all available maintenance resources. Ethan wrote it down. What else? Air handling on sub-level 2 is showing a pressure differential that shouldn't be there. System's compensating, so it's not triggering an alarm. But if you look at the compensation curve, it's working about 30% harder than it should. How long? 3 weeks. Maybe 4. A pause. Ethan, the demo is in 7 days. They've got federal clients coming. Department of Defense liaison, 2 congressional staffers, a private sector security consortium. Victor's been up here 3 times this week checking presentation layouts. Is anyone looking at the sub-level systems? Silence on the line, which was its own answer. Marcus, I've flagged it internally, twice. I got back a response saying the maintenance schedule would be reviewed post-demonstration. Marcus's voice was careful, controlled. But there was something underneath the control that Ethan recognized. The specific sound of a man who knows something is wrong and has been told, in various institutional ways, to stop knowing it. I have a family, Ethan. I know you do. I'm not saying I won't. I'm just saying I've got a lot riding on staying employed here. I know, Marcus. I'm not asking you to do anything. I know you're not asking. He paused again. That's what makes it worse. After he hung up, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the phone face down and the fault logs in front of him and thought about the geometry of what was coming. He'd been doing this long enough, building complex systems, modeling failure scenarios, that he could see the shape of a convergence before it fully arrived. It was like weather in that sense. You couldn't always say exactly when it was going to hit, but the pressure systems didn't lie. Sub-level 5 relay fault, unaddressed for 10 weeks. Air handling compensation on sub-level 2, active for 3 to 4 weeks and still climbing. The hydraulic pressure variance he'd flagged in August, which, based on the degradation curve he'd projected, would be near its critical threshold by mid-November. No manual override. Victor Kane standing in front of federal clients with his presentation layouts. 7 days. He picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't called in 18 months. It rang 4 times, and then a woman's voice said, "Mercer, I was wondering when you'd call." Her name was Audrey Weston, and she worked for a federal oversight body whose specific mandate he'd been careful not to fully understand when they'd first spoken. Careful because he needed the option of deniability, and because the more specifically he understood her role, the more specifically implicated he became in whatever she did with the information. What he knew was that she dealt with safety compliance in high-security federal contractor facilities, and that she'd contacted him 8 months ago after his external report had surfaced through a channel he hadn't explicitly tracked. He hadn't called her back then because he'd still been employed and still believed the internal process had a path forward. "I'm calling now," he said. "I have your reports. All of them." "Then you know what the picture looks like." "I know what it looked like when you filed them." She was measured in her speech, not cold, but precise. "What's it look like now?" He told her. The relay fault, the air handling, the hydraulic variance, the demonstration timeline, the work orders that had been bumped. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You said the emergency protocol was modified." "The administrative version was. The surface version." A pause. "Is there another version?" He didn't answer that directly. "I'm saying the surface version was modified. The one Victor's office can see and control." Another pause. Longer this time. She was smart enough to understand what he was and wasn't saying. If there's a failure event during the demonstration, I don't want a failure event. I want someone with authority to look at the sub-level systems before the demonstration. That takes time, Ethan. Inspection requests go through. I know what they go through. I'm not filing an inspection request. I'm calling you at 8:30 at night telling you I know what I'm looking at, and I'm telling you that the confluence of these specific failure modes in a facility with underground operational zones and modified emergency protocols is something that warrants someone paying attention in the next 7 days. She was quiet again. Then, "I hear you." "Good. I'm not promising anything about timeline." "I know. And if you have documentation, the kind that demonstrates the revision discrepancy in the compliance filings, I have it. Send it to me, tonight." "All right." He sent her 43 pages of documentation organized into 7 sections, with a cover note that was 3 sentences long. He'd always believed in short cover notes. The documents either made the case or they didn't. After he sent it, he sat in the kitchen for a while in the way he'd been sitting in various rooms for the past month. Not doing nothing exactly, but not doing the specific thing that needed to come next. Because the specific thing that came next was mostly waiting, and waiting was the hardest kind of work. On the 5th day before the demonstration, Lily came home from school with a project she'd been assigned. A diagram of a simple system, any system, demonstrating input-process-output relationships. It was a 4th grade assignment, not complicated. Her teacher wanted colorful posters. She spread out on the living room floor with markers and large paper and started drawing. Ethan was on the couch with his laptop, running through hydraulic failure mode calculations that he had no professional reason to be running through and couldn't stop himself from running through anyway. After a while, he became aware that Lily had stopped drawing and was looking at him. "Can I ask you something technical?" she said. "Yeah. If a system has a thing that's supposed to happen automatically, like when condition A and condition B both happen, then thing C happens automatically. But someone changes it so that a person has to say yes before C happens." She paused. "Is that better or worse?" He looked at her over the laptop. "Why are you asking?" "Because you explained some of the stuff in your files to me once, when I was asking about your work. And I've been thinking about it." "How much have you been thinking about it?" "A lot," she said, with the directness that was one of her consistent qualities. "The door one especially. You said the doors were supposed to open automatically if something bad happened, and then they changed it so someone had to say yes first." "That's basically right. What if the person who has to say yes isn't there, or doesn't say yes? Then the doors don't open." She looked back at her paper, uncapped a blue marker. "That's bad engineering," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She drew something on the paper. He couldn't see what from the angle. And then she said, without looking up, "Did you fix it?" He didn't answer right away. She added another line to her drawing. You don't have to tell me if it's complicated. It's complicated, he said. Okay. She capped the blue marker and picked up a red one. But you fixed it, right? He looked at his laptop screen. The hydraulic degradation curve, the timeline. 7 days minus 5 equaled 2. The demonstration was in 2 days. Yeah, he said quietly. I fixed it. She nodded, like this confirmed something she'd already worked out. Good, she said, and went back to her poster. The demonstration was scheduled to begin at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. By noon that day, Ethan knew from Marcus, a text, just 3 words, full house downstairs, that the maintenance crews had been deployed to sub-level operations to support the facility's demonstration readiness activities, which meant the people who would normally monitor the fault systems were occupied with other things, which meant the relay fault on sub-level 5 and the air handling variance on sub-level 2 and the hydraulic pressure anomaly on levels 3 through 5 were all running unmonitored on the day of the largest demonstration Black Mesa Dynamics had ever hosted. Ethan sat at his kitchen table at noon on Thursday and looked at his phone and then at the clock and then at the 43 pages of documentation he'd sent to Audrey Weston 5 days ago, the pages she'd acknowledged receiving and said she was reviewing. He hadn't heard back. He called her. Voicemail. He texted Marcus. Is there anyone in the mechanical monitoring room right now? The reply came back after 4 minutes. Demo prep pulled everyone. It's running automated. Automated monitoring, which meant the alerts would log in the system, which meant if something happened, there would be a record of the warnings, which was the worst possible version of accountability, the kind that comes after, documented in the incident report. Ethan stood up from the kitchen table, walked to the living room window, and stood there for a while looking at the street outside. Lily was at school. She had a play date at her friend Mara's house after, and he wasn't supposed to pick her up until 6. The demonstration started at 7. He walked to his office, opened the closet, moved the box of Lily's school projects, and opened the fireproof lockbox. He took out the drive. He sat down at his desk and connected it to his laptop and opened the file he needed, the one with the full technical documentation of what he'd built into the base layer of the system. The authorization confirmation sequence, his credentials, the passive mode renewal protocol that he'd been running every 180 days and had let lapse in October when they walked him out of the building. He looked at the screen for a long time. The passive mode had lapsed October 14th. Today was November 13th. That was 30 days into the 90-day monitor window, which meant the protocol was already awake, already watching. It was watching right now, passively, invisibly, reading the system's telemetry through the foundation layer, comparing current conditions against the compound failure criteria. It was watching, and it was waiting, and somewhere below grade in the eastern corridor of Black Mesa Dynamics, a hydraulic relay had been faulting twice a shift for 10 weeks. Ethan closed the laptop. He couldn't remotely trigger the protocol. It wasn't designed to be triggered remotely. It was designed to respond to conditions inside the building. That had been intentional. What he could do, what he was sitting here with the weight of, was call Rebecca Holloway directly. Call Victor. Call Audrey Weston again and again until she picked up. Drive to the facility himself and tell them to stop the demonstration until someone went down to sub-level 5 and looked at the relay in the eastern corridor. He knew what would happen if he did that. He also knew what might happen if he didn't. He sat with that for 23 minutes by the clock on his desk. And then he picked up his phone and called Rebecca Holloway's direct line. Not the executive office number, the direct cell number she'd given him 4 years ago when he'd been 3 weeks into diagnosing a cascading failure in the original security backbone. And she'd said, "Call me any time. I mean it." It rang twice. Then it went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He picked up his keys instead and his coat, and he wrote a note for Lily. At an errand, back by 5:30. Call if you need me. And he left it on the kitchen counter where she'd see it if she got home early. Then he drove toward Black Mesa. He didn't have a plan exactly. He had a car and a drive that was 22 minutes on a clear day, and the clear, specific knowledge of what was in the ground beneath a building where people were going to be working tonight, while Victor Kane stood in a presentation room and told federal clients that the system was flawless. The sky had gone dark at the edges, the way it does in November, the color of old iron, the clouds moving fast from the northwest. It looked like weather coming. He drove, and he thought, and on the passenger seat his phone screen stayed dark. The command center was the kind of room that looked impressive when everything was working and looked like the inside of a failing argument when it wasn't. 3 of the 8 monitors were still displaying the audit cascade, the revision logs, the compliance documentation discrepancies, the maintenance fault records scrolling in pale text against dark backgrounds with the patient indifference of a system that had been waiting a long time to show this particular information to this particular room. The other 5 monitors had been manually toggled to system status displays, which someone had done in an attempt to regain a sense of operational control. The attempt had not fully succeeded. The humanitarian protocol's active state lock was still running, which meant the administrative layer was still in restricted mode, which meant half the status displays were showing read-only data that nobody in the room could act on. Victor Kane was standing at the primary control station. Ethan saw him from across the room and understood immediately that something had shifted in the 47 minutes since the relay on sublevel 5 had gone critical. Victor was still physically present in his usual way, the deliberate posture, the contained energy, but the quality of his presence had changed. He was standing at a console he couldn't control, in a room full of people watching him not control it, and the specific kind of authority that Victor Kane had spent 6 years building at Black Mesa Dynamics required, as its fundamental condition, that the things he touched responded to him. The building was not responding to him. 3 people Ethan didn't know were in the room, 2 in suits with federal identification lanyards, 1 in a dark jacket, who had the look of someone from a technical oversight function. The DoD liaison Marcus had mentioned. She was off to the side with her phone at her ear, watching the monitor cascade with the focused attention of a person assembling a picture she'd suspected the shape of for some time. Rebecca walked in ahead of Ethan. The room noticed her arrival and then, 1 beat later, noticed what was behind her. The federal liaisons looked at Ethan. The DoD woman lowered her phone slightly. Marcus, who was at a secondary console in the back corner, made a small movement that was either relief or resignation or both simultaneously. Victor turned. The expression on his face when he saw Ethan went through 3 distinct phases in under 2 seconds. The first was pure recognition. The second was something that combined fury with the specific alarm of a man who has spent weeks building a narrative and has just seen its central character walk through the door. The third was a kind of controlled surface that descended over both of those things like a shutter closing, the professional composure reasserting itself through force of will. "What is he doing in here?" Victor said. Not shouting, controlled, precise, directed at Rebecca. "He's here to help stabilize the system," Rebecca said. "He doesn't have authorization to be in this building. He doesn't have credentials. He is a former employee who—" "Victor." Rebecca's voice was flat and certain in a way Ethan hadn't heard from her before. It was the voice of someone who had finished a particular internal argument and closed the door on it. "The system is in a state that none of our current staff can fully address. Ethan designed the core architecture. He's going to help us understand what's running and how to manage the transition out of the active protocol state." "There is no protocol that—" Victor stopped. He looked at the monitors, the scrolling audit logs. His jaw tightened. Ethan walked to the primary console. He was aware of Victor 3 feet to his left, the way you're aware of weather. Its direction, its pressure, its potential. He didn't look at him. He looked at the displays. The humanitarian protocol was still in active state, which was correct. It was designed to stay active until egress was fully confirmed. The system's internal sensors needed to register all sublevel zones as clear before it would begin the transition back to standby. 3 zones were still showing amber: sublevel 3 eastern section, sublevel 4 central corridor, and sublevel 5 primary access. Those weren't people. The workers were all out. Those were residual sensor readings from the zones where the blast door hydraulics had been stressed during the activation sequence and hadn't fully completed their position confirmation cycle. "The remaining amber zones," Ethan said to Marcus, "are they people or door position sensors?" Marcus pulled up the zone detail. "Door position sensors, all 3. The hydraulic pressure on the sub-5 blast doors is reading incomplete extension. The doors are open, but the sensor confirmation cycle didn't complete because the relay failure interrupted the handshake. Can you get a visual on Sub 5 Central? Camera's up on Sub 5. Marcus switched one of the readable monitors to the camera feed. The corridor was empty. Amber light, open doors, nobody in the space. Okay. Ethan leaned toward the diagnostic interface at the primary console. I can manually complete the sensor confirmation from the base layer. It'll take the system about 4 minutes to process the zone clear and begin transition out of active state. Once it transitions, the administrative layer unlocks and you'll have full control back. He said the last part to Rebecca. She nodded. He worked. It was not complicated work. It was methodical, the kind of task that required accuracy rather than speed, moving through the base layer interface with the familiarity of someone who had built the terrain he was navigating. The room was quiet while he did it, with the particular quality of a room full of people who have things to say and are waiting for the right moment. Victor was the one who couldn't wait. "What you did tonight," Victor said. His voice was measured, careful. But the care was visible, which meant the control was effortful. Installing an unauthorized protocol into a federal contractor facility's security infrastructure. Do you understand the legal exposure that represents? Ethan didn't look up from the console. Yes. That's a federal offense. Unauthorized modification of security systems at a... Victor. The DoD liaison spoke for the first time. Her name, Ethan learned later, was Hartwell. She was perhaps 50, with the manner of someone who spent her professional life in rooms where authority was being contested and had long ago stopped finding it interesting. "I need you to stop talking for a few minutes." Victor looked at her. "Excuse me?" "I need you to stop talking," she said again, without any particular edge, "because I'm trying to understand what's on those monitors, and your voice is making it harder." She looked at him for a moment. "Please." The please was worse than if she'd left it out. Victor understood that. He stopped talking. Ethan finished the sensor confirmation sequence. The system processed it. At 3 minutes and 48 seconds, the zone indicators shifted from amber to green in sequence. Sub 5 first, then Sub 4, then Sub 3 Eastern. The humanitarian protocol's active state display changed. Egress confirmed. All zones clear. Initiating transition to standby administrative layer unlocking. Please wait. The monitors that had been locked to read only flickered once and went editable. 2 of the 3 audit cascade displays continued running. The protocol was designed to keep surfacing the documentation until an administrator explicitly cleared it, because Ethan had believed that the documentation deserved to be seen for long enough to be fully understood, not just glimpsed. Rebecca was looking at the audit cascade. She'd been looking at it, Ethan realized, since she'd walked in. In the time it had taken him to work through the sensor confirmation, she'd been standing to his right reading revision logs and compliance discrepancy records with an expression that was doing something complicated and private. "The February revision," she said quietly. To no one in particular, or to herself. The one that reclassified the override from automatic to manual authorization. She paused. The compliance documentation that was submitted to support that revision. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Hartwell was also reading. She had been for the past 3 minutes, and whatever she was reading was doing something to her posture. A gradual straightening, a subtle intensification of attention. "Mr. Mercer," Hartwell said. "Yes. The documentation on these monitors, the revision history, the compliance discrepancy records, the maintenance fault logs, this is coming from inside the system's own audit layer?" "Yes. The humanitarian protocol surfaces its own documentation as part of the activation sequence. It's designed to make the record visible at the same time it acts on it." "You built that?" "Yes." "When?" 3 years ago, February of the year I was hired." Hartwell looked at the monitors for a long moment. Then she looked at Victor Kane. It was not a long look, but it had a specific quality to it. The look of someone who has just finished assembling a picture and is confirming the last piece. Victor said, "The documentation he's referring to has been..." He stopped. Started again. "The revision to the emergency protocol was made in compliance with applicable federal security standards. I can provide the documentation. The documentation is on the monitors," Hartwell said. I can see the documentation. I can also see the documentation it was compared against, and I can see that they don't match, which is interesting. The room was very quiet. I'm going to need access to your office's revision records, Hartwell said. All of them. Tonight. She looked at one of the suited individuals beside her. Start the request. The suited individual started the request. Victor's face had arrived at a place that Ethan had never seen on it before. The professional composure was still there. Victor was too experienced to let it go entirely. But something beneath it had given way, not collapsed exactly. More like a load-bearing element that had exceeded its rating, still standing, no longer reliable. This is, Victor said, this is one man's interpretation of a system he partially built and then was terminated from. You're taking his word. We're taking the system's word, Rebecca said. She said it quietly, without looking at Victor. She was still looking at the monitors. The sentence landed in the room, and nobody answered it. The next 2 hours were the kind that compress in memory, dense with event, crowded with people and decisions, but experienced in the moment with a strange flatness, the way significant things sometimes feel while they're happening as opposed to afterward. Ethan moved through them doing what he'd been asked to do, which was explain the system's state and support the technical team's work of returning the facility to safe operational mode. Hartwell and her team established a working space at the secondary console cluster. They were methodical and quick in the way of people who had done this before. Not this specific situation, but this category of situation, where a facility's documented record diverged from its operational reality in ways that had consequences for federal contracts. They asked Ethan questions, and he answered them. He showed them the base layer architecture. He walked them through the protocol's trigger logic, the compound failure conditions, the decision tree, the audit function. He showed them everything. He'd decided, in the service lot in the rain before Rebecca had come out to find him, that the only version of this night that ended well was the one where everything was visible. The parallel records from the fireproof box in his closet, the photographs from the server room, the revision timestamps, the fault logs, the documentation discrepancies. He'd sent all of it to Hartwell's secure channel before he'd left his car in the service lot. 43 pages plus the supplementary files. She'd confirmed receipt at 10:08 p.m. Torres appeared at some point. He'd come up from sub 2 after the lockdown cleared and had given a statement to one of Hartwell's team members about the relay failure and the spare parts inventory and the work orders that had been bumped for demonstration prep. Torres was precise in his account. He didn't editorialize. He was the kind of man who understood that precision was its own editorial. Marcus worked at his console with the quiet competence he'd always had, pulling data when it was needed, confirming records, speaking when spoken to and not otherwise. At one point, catching Ethan's eye across the room, he gave a small nod that meant everything and nothing specific. Reyes and Park gave statements. They described the corridor, the locked stairwell, the amber light when the humanitarian protocol activated, and the blast door releasing. Park, in his statement, said, "The system opened the door. I've been doing this job for 11 years, and I've never seen a security system open a door because it decided to." He seemed to think about that for a moment. It made the right call. Victor stood at the edge of the room for a long time. He was on his phone at certain points, in conversation with someone Ethan assumed was legal counsel. At other points, he wasn't on the phone, just standing. The two junior executives who'd been in the lobby the night Ethan was fired were also present. They had the look of people who were urgently recalibrating which direction they'd been facing, and were discovering that the recalibration was more complicated than they'd hoped. At 11:20 p.m., Rebecca pulled Ethan into a side office. The office was a standard management space, conference table, 6 chairs, a whiteboard with something written on it from what appeared to be a meeting from 3 weeks ago that hadn't been erased. She closed the door. She didn't sit down, and Ethan didn't sit down. And they stood on opposite sides of the conference table in the room that smelled of dry erase markers and recycled air. "The protocol you built into the base layer," she said. "The unauthorized one." "Yes. You understood when you built it that doing it without authorization was a significant breach." "Yes. And you did it anyway." "I filed 8 months of reports first." He wasn't defensive about it. It was just true. I documented the risk. I escalated through every available channel. The last report I filed, the one that went to your executive office, included a specific section on what would happen if the sub-level relay systems failed in combination with the blast door authorization chain. That report was acknowledged and routed to a compliance coordinator who sent me a template response. Rebecca looked at the table. She had a pen in her hand that she hadn't been holding when she walked in. She'd picked it up from the table without noticing, the way people pick up objects when they're thinking. She was turning it over in her fingers. "I should have read it myself," she said. It wasn't quite an apology. It was something more honest than an apology, an acknowledgement that didn't dress itself up. "Yes," Ethan said. "You should have." She absorbed that. The people on sub 4 and 5 tonight, if Torres hadn't gotten them to the stairwell before the lockdown, 30 seconds, maybe less. She set the pen down. "Victor told me consistently that your concerns were coming from a place of personal investment, that you'd built the original system and couldn't accept that it had been improved upon. I know what Victor told you. I let that framing shape how I read your reports. I know that too." She looked at him directly. She had the quality, when she was being fully honest, of someone who didn't enjoy it but did it anyway because the alternative was worse. "What do you want, Ethan, tonight, from this? What do you actually want?" He thought about it. Not performatively. He genuinely thought about it. Standing in the office with the dry erase smell and the unoccupied chairs, because the question deserved a real answer, and he owed it to himself to know what that answer was. "I want the maintenance workers on sub 4 and 5 to go home and go to sleep without knowing how close it was," he said. "I want the relay on sub 5 replaced by someone with the right spare parts before this building goes back into full operation. I want the compliance documentation Victor filed to be reviewed by people who have the authority to understand what they're looking at." He paused. "And I want Diane Chen's name on the air handling report she wrote 18 months ago that got buried." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "That's it?" "That's not nothing." "No," she said, "it isn't." She picked up the pen again, looked at it, put it back down. "We're going to have to talk about what comes next. For the company. For you. Professionally. That conversation is going to be more complicated than tonight." "I know. I'm not in a position to make commitments right now. Tonight is still..." She gestured toward the door, toward the room beyond it, where Hartwell's team was still working and the audit cascade was still running on 2 monitors. "Tonight has a long way to go." "I know that too." She went to the door, stopped. Without turning around, she said, "The drawing, the one Lily made. You had it on your monitor." He hadn't expected that. "Yeah." "The building with all the open doors." She paused. "I saw it once, when I came down to your floor. I thought it was, I don't know, sentimental. The kind of thing that told a story about a person who was too attached to a particular vision of what things should be." Another pause. "I was reading it wrong." She opened the door and went back into the command center. Dead. At 12:40 a.m., Ethan went outside. Not because he'd been asked to leave. The situation inside had reached a stage where Hartwell's team was running the documentation review and the technical staff had the system stabilized, and his presence in the command center had become less necessary than his own body's need for cold air and a minute without other people's problems pressing against him. He stood at the top of the main entrance steps. The rain had stopped at some point while he was inside, and the air had that washed quality that November rain leaves behind. Cleaner than it was before, colder, smelling of wet concrete, and the particular absence of whatever was in the air before it came down. The parking lot was full. Federal vehicles, a second ambulance that had arrived and then stood down. 2 marked vehicles from a municipal authority that Hartwell had apparently contacted as a precaution. Torres was in the parking lot, leaning against a railing, eating something from a vending machine bag with the abstracted efficiency of a man who hasn't eaten since noon and is only doing it now because his body has started making it impossible to ignore. He saw Ethan and held up the bag. "Pretzels?" "Yeah, actually." Ethan went down the steps and took a handful. They were the kind of pretzels that come from industrial vending machines. Oversalted, slightly stale, completely satisfying in the way that things are when you're hungry enough not to have opinions. "How are your people?" All 6 are home. I called each one. Torres ate another pretzel. Hendricks, the one on sub 5 who took longest to acknowledge the radio call, she was at the far end of the eastern corridor, 4 minutes to the stairwell. He looked at his pretzel bag. She's got a 6-month-old at home. Ethan didn't say anything to that. She doesn't know how close it was, Torres continued. I didn't tell her. I don't know if that was right. She'll find out, Ethan said. Eventually, these things get out. Yeah, Torres folded the top of the pretzel bag. Better from someone who was there than from a news story. Probably. They stood in the parking lot for a while. Above them, through the glass face of the building, the command center lights were visible. The reduced functional lighting of a space in the middle of serious work. The kind of light that means people are doing something that matters and will be there until it's done. What happens to Victor? Torres said. I don't know exactly. Hartwell's team has the documentation. The federal contracts are going to be reviewed. Ethan looked at the building. Victor's been the security chief here for 6 years. He's built relationships, pipelines, a record that has real things in it alongside the things that aren't real. How it shakes out depends on what the review determines and who at the federal level decides it's worth pursuing. You think they'll pursue it. Hartwell has 43 pages of documentation with revision timestamps and cross-referenced compliance filings. She's not the kind of person who puts that in a drawer. He paused. I think they'll pursue it. Torres nodded. And you? What about me? Unauthorized modification of a federal contractor facility's security infrastructure. Torres said it without any particular judgment. The way you state a fact to see how the person across from you responds to it. That's a real thing, Ethan said. I did it. I knew what I was doing when I did it. The people in that stairwell are alive because you did it. Also true. So those two things are both true at the same time, and what happens because of them is going to be determined by people above my pay grade. He ate the last of the pretzels Torres had given him. I don't have a clean answer for it. I made a call. I'd make the same call again. What that means legally and professionally, I'll find out. Torres looked at him for a moment with the level assessment of a man who respects a direct answer. For what it's worth, he said, I've been in this building for 3 years, and I've worked with the system you built, the sub-level infrastructure, the relay architecture, the way the conduit runs are organized. He paused. It's good work. It's careful work. Whoever built it was thinking about the people in the building, not just the specs. Ethan looked at the bag of pretzels in Torres's hand, now empty. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm just an on-call tech who told 6 people to move because a fired engineer called on a burner and said to. Torres pushed off from the railing. I'm going back in. Hartwell's people wanted a walkthrough of the sub-2 distribution panel. Tell them to look at the supply line on the east face of the cabinet. The burn pattern starts there. Already in my notes. Torres went up the steps. Ethan stayed in the parking lot. His phone had 17 unread messages from a number he didn't recognize, which turned out to be a journalist at a regional outlet who had apparently monitored the emergency frequencies and knew something significant had happened at Black Mesa. He didn't respond. He had 2 from Audrey Weston, the first saying she was aware of the situation, and the second saying she'd spoken with Hartwell and the documentation had been received and was being evaluated. He sent her a brief reply. Everyone's out, system stable. Her response was immediate. I know, I heard, I'm glad. Then, you're going to have to talk to people about the unauthorized protocol. I know. I'll help where I can. He put the phone away. At 1:15 a.m., Marcus came outside. He was wearing his jacket wrong, line by a scene. One arm through the sleeve, the other side draped over his shoulder, and he had the look of a man who had been sitting at a console for 4 hours, and whose body was only now communicating the extent of its objection to that. He stood next to Ethan without saying anything for a moment. Then, you know what I keep thinking about? What? The drawing, the one Lily made, the one you had on your monitor. Ethan looked at him. The doors, Marcus said, all open. I must have looked at that drawing 1,000 times over the past however many months, every time I sat down at my station. He was quiet for a second. I thought it was just a kid's drawing of her dad's work. It is. Yeah, but, Marcus paused. Tonight those doors were open because of something you put in the foundation years ago, and Lily drew that picture before you did it. She drew it after I submitted the first protocol proposal. We'd talked about it, what the system was supposed to do, what it was built to protect. And she just drew it. She said she'd make the doors bigger. Ethan looked up at the building. She was right. I made them bigger in the next revision. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The sub-5 relay fault I mentioned to you 6 weeks ago when I called. I know, Marcus. I should have pushed harder internally. You pushed as hard as you could with what you had. That's not... He stopped. That doesn't feel like enough. No, Ethan said. It doesn't. But it's what you had, and you used it. That counts. He looked at his friend, the jacket worn wrong, the exhaustion, the specific weight of a man who has been right about something for a long time and is only now seeing the consequences of everyone around him being wrong. Go home, sleep, come back tomorrow, and do the same thing you did tonight, which is tell the truth about what you see in the systems you monitor. That's what counts. Marcus was quiet for a while. Then he fixed his jacket. You think they'll ask you back? He said. Rebecca mentioned it might come up. Would you come back? Ethan thought about the cardboard box in his car, the coffee mug, the framed photo of Lily at the beach, the drawing, folded once and laid on top. I'd come back to finish what I built, he said, to make sure it's right, not for anything else. Not for Victor. Victor's not really a factor anymore. Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah. He looked at the building. Yeah, I think that's right. He went back inside. Ethan stayed in the parking lot for another few minutes, not because he was waiting for anything specific, just because there's a particular quality to the air after a thing has happened and resolved, when the full weight of what it might have been settles alongside the relief of what it actually was. And that quality deserves a moment of attention before you go back to the business of ordinary life. 18 people had gone underground tonight. 18 people had come back up. He thought about Hendrix, who had a 6-month-old at home and had been at the far end of the sub-5 Eastern Corridor and had come back up in time because Torres had made a call on a direct maintenance channel and because 6 years ago a man who understood failure modes before features had built a conscience into the ground beneath this building and then refused, at considerable personal cost, to let it be erased. He thought about Lily's drawing on the refrigerator. The door's bigger now, the hinges careful, the handles angled exactly right. He took out his phone. He texted Lily, coming home soon. She'd been at Mara's house for 6 hours. He'd checked with Mara's mom that she'd gone to sleep there, which she probably had. The reply came back in under a minute, which meant she hadn't gone to sleep at all. I've been awake. I wanted to know everyone was out. He stared at the message. Everyone's out, he typed back. Every single one, 3 dots. Then, good. Now come home. He walked to his car. The service lot was quiet. The vehicles had thinned as the night wore on, and the immediate crisis gave way to the slower work of documentation and investigation and all the things that happen after. He found his car in the blind spot between the 2 cameras, which he'd parked in automatically and had not thought much about since. He sat behind the wheel for a moment. The building's amber lights were still visible through the north service door, the humanitarian protocol's active state indicator, still running because the formal transition to standby required confirmation from a facility administrator, a step that hadn't been completed yet because Hartwell's team was still working and Rebecca was occupied and the building was, in a very literal sense, still waiting for someone to tell it the emergency was over. It would be told that by morning. The protocol would complete its transition, the amber lights would go green, the blast doors would return to standard operational mode. The administrative layer would fully unlock, and the command center would have the control back that it was supposed to have, and the humanitarian protocol would return to passive standby. Invisible, dormant, built into the foundation where it had always been, doing nothing and doing the most important thing simultaneously, being there in case it was needed again. Ethan started the car. He drove home through the clean post-rain air, and the city looked different at 1:30 a.m. than it looked in the daylight. Quieter, its true structure more visible without the noise of its daily operation, the bones of it showing. He'd always liked cities at this hour. They reminded him of systems at rest, not broken, just being exactly what they were, without the performance layer. He pulled into his driveway at 1:47 a.m. and sat for a moment. Through the living room window, he could see the light that Lily had left on for him. He got out of the car, walked to the door, and went inside. She was on the couch under a blanket, which she'd clearly been using to watch the door, and when he came in, she looked up at him with the assessing look she always used when she was checking whether someone was okay and didn't want to come right out and ask. He stood in the doorway still in his jacket. "Everyone's out," he said again, because it was worth saying twice. She nodded. "I know, you texted." She looked at him for another moment. "Are you okay?" He thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and the simple answer, which was also true. "Yeah," he said. "I am." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "The doors worked." "Yeah, Lil, the doors worked." She looked at him with the steady, clear-eyed quality she'd always had, the quality that sometimes made him feel like she understood more than a 10-year-old should need to understand, and sometimes made him feel like the luckiest person in a given room. "Good," she said. And then, "There's soup on the stove. I made it from the can, but I added stuff." He hung up his jacket. "What stuff?" "Spices. I don't know which ones. I smelled them." He went to the kitchen. The soup was on the stove on low, and it smelled considerably better than soup from a can had any right to smell, which suggested her spice selection had been sound even if she couldn't name them. He poured it into a bowl and sat at the kitchen table. On the refrigerator, held by the lighthouse magnet, Lily's new drawing caught the light. The building with its careful doors, the hinges and the handles, and every single door open. She'd added something since he'd last looked at it. Small figures in the doorways this time, not just passing through but standing there like people who had somewhere to be and also wanted for just a moment to stand in the open air. He ate the soup. It was good. The soup was gone and the kitchen light was still on at 2:40 a.m. when Ethan finally got Lily to go upstairs. She'd held out longer than he'd expected, not asking questions exactly, just staying present in the way she did when she sensed that something had shifted and wanted to be near the shift. He understood the instinct. He had it himself. But she had school in 6 hours, and her eyes had been doing the slow, involuntary thing that eyes do when the body has overruled the mind's insistence on staying awake. He stood in her doorway for a moment after she'd settled, looking at the yellow raincoat hanging on the hook behind her door, the broken zipper, the iron-on patches of cartoon animals along the collar. Then he went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water he didn't particularly want, and the particular silence of a house at 2:40 a.m., which is different from all other silences, more honest somehow, less maintained. He knew what was coming, not the specifics, but the shape of it. The federal review, the legal questions surrounding the unauthorized protocol, the restructuring of whatever Black Mesa looked like after Hartwell's team finished with it. He'd spent enough time in institutions to understand how institutions processed events like this one, slowly, with competing agendas, and with a tendency to resolve ambiguity in the direction of whoever had the best documentation. He had the best documentation. That helped, and it wasn't nothing, and it also didn't resolve everything cleanly, because nothing real ever does. He went to bed at 3:15. He slept, which surprised him. Yet. The calls started at 7:50 a.m. The first was from a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be a communications coordinator from Hartwell's federal office, confirming that his documentation had been formally entered into the oversight record and that he should expect to be contacted by the review team within the next 72 hours. The coordinator was professional and precise and communicated nothing beyond what she'd been directed to communicate. He thanked her and hung up. The second was Audrey Weston, who called at 8:20 while he was driving Lily to school. "I'm putting you on speaker," he told her. "Lily's in the car." "Hi, Lily," Audrey said. Lily looked at the phone. "Hi. I'm someone who works with your father on some technical things. I'm glad everyone is okay." "Me too," Lily said, and then looked back out the window with the particular discretion of a 10-year-old who has learned that adults sometimes need to talk around children rather than to them. "I'll call you back in 15 minutes, Ethan told Audrey. He dropped Lily at school. She got out of the car with her backpack and her yellow raincoat and walked toward the entrance without looking back, which was her standard practice. She'd established early that goodbye at the school door was for younger kids, and he'd learned to read the way she didn't look back as its own kind of acknowledgement. He watched until she was through the door. Audrey picked up on the first ring. "The preliminary review is moving faster than I expected," she said. "Hartwell's office has flagged the compliance discrepancies as a priority concern because two of the other facilities in Black Mesa's federal contract portfolio use variants of the same security architecture. If the humanitarian override modification was applied as a standard approach, I don't know if it was. I only know what was done at Black Mesa. That's what they're checking now. The point is, it's not just one building anymore. It's potentially a pattern which changes the federal interest level considerably." Ethan drove through a neighborhood he passed every morning without particularly seeing, the houses presenting their quiet November faces to the street. What does that mean for the timeline? It means the review isn't going to take months. They're treating it as an active compliance concern, not a retrospective investigation. Victor Kane has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. A pause. "Rebecca was notified this morning." "I know. She texted me at 7. "What did she say?" He thought about the text, which had been brief and not quite any single emotion. "Victor on leave as of this morning. The review is in process. I'd like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. I understand if that takes some time." "She wants to meet," he said. "Are you going to?" "Yes, but not today." He needed a day. Not because he was avoiding anything, but because yesterday had been a long time and he hadn't yet fully metabolized it. And he'd learned the hard way that decisions made before you've metabolized a significant event tend to be decisions you revisit. "The unauthorized protocol question," Audrey said, the one he'd been waiting for her to get to. "Hartwell's team has been discussing it internally. The legal framework around base layer modifications in federal contractor facilities is..." She paused. "It's not simple." "I know it's not simple. What you did was genuinely unauthorized. That's not in dispute. The question is how to characterize it, given that the modification saved people's lives and exposed compliance fraud, which are two outcomes that complicate the standard unauthorized access framing considerably. They complicate it because it's complicated." "Yes," she said. "Exactly. My recommendation, and this is informal, not official, is that you get a lawyer who understands federal contractor security law before you meet with anyone from Hartwell's formal review team." "I have someone in mind." "Good." A brief pause. "For what it's worth, Ethan. Off the record." "Yeah. You were right. About everything. For 3 years you were right and nobody with authority wanted to hear it. And last night 18 people came home because of something you built when you still had the access to build it. I know the legal question is real, and I'm not minimizing it, but I wanted to say that out loud." He drove in silence for a moment. "Thank you, Audrey." "Don't thank me. I should have moved faster on the preliminary inquiry. 5 days was..." She stopped. "I should have moved faster." "You moved as fast as the system allowed." "That's the same thing Marcus said to you last night, about himself." "It's still true." She was quiet for a beat. "Go get a lawyer, Ethan." He got a lawyer. Odd. Her name was Constance Park, no relation to the security officer from the night before, and she came recommended by a former colleague who'd navigated a whistleblower situation at a defense subcontractor 4 years ago. She was in her late 50s, with the manner of someone who had been in enough rooms where authority was misbehaving that she'd long since stopped being impressed by it, and she listened to Ethan's complete account over 2 hours in her office, without interrupting except to ask precise factual questions about sequence and timing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You documented everything," she said. "Yes. From the beginning. From the first objection. And the base layer modification. You documented that too, in your own files. Full technical documentation, architecture, logic, trigger conditions, audit function, dated and encrypted." She looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard a lot of people describe things they did and is deciding how to characterize this particular one. "Most people in your position either don't document or document selectively, self-servingly. I documented what I did, all of it." including the parts that create legal exposure for you. Especially those. She picked up her pen. The legal framework on this is genuinely complicated, but the complication runs in multiple directions. The unauthorized modification question is real. So is the question of whether a facility's intentional suppression of safety documentation and fraudulent compliance filings creates a different context for evaluating what constitutes unauthorized action in response. She tapped the pen on her notepad. These aren't settled questions. They're going to require argument. I understand. I'm also going to tell you that the outcome last night, the fact that the modification worked as designed, that it activated correctly, that it produced no collateral damage to the facility or personnel, and that it simultaneously exposed the compliance fraud. That's a different situation than if the protocol had malfunctioned or caused additional harm. Courts and federal reviewers are human beings. Context matters. I'm not looking to walk away clean, Ethan said. I'm looking to tell the truth about what I did and why, and let it be evaluated on those terms. She looked at him for a moment. That's either the most sensible thing I've heard from a client in a long time, or the most naive. Probably both. She almost smiled. Probably. She opened a new page in her notepad. Let's start from the beginning. He met with Rebecca 4 days later. Not at Black Mesa. She suggested a neutral location, which told him something about her thinking, and they settled on a hotel conference room in the city that was entirely without character, but had a reasonable coffee service and no particular associations for either of them. She was there when he arrived, which he hadn't expected. He'd assumed she'd be 5 or 10 minutes late, not deliberately, just from the weight of everything on her plate since Thursday night. But she was already seated when he came in, with a coffee in front of her and the look of someone who had been there long enough to think through what she wanted to say. He sat down across from her. A hotel employee appeared with coffee and disappeared again. Victor resigned this morning, Rebecca said. Ethan looked at her. Resigned or was pushed? He had the option to resign. He took it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, the same gesture he'd seen from himself, the thing people do when they're thinking and need something physical to hold. The formal separation includes a provision for his cooperation with the federal review. His legal counsel negotiated it. Is he going to cooperate? His counsel says yes. My read on Victor is... She paused. Victor is pragmatic. When the wind changes, he adjusts. He adjusted. Ethan thought about that. He'd expected to feel something more distinct at the news. Satisfaction, maybe, or relief. What he felt was closer to the flat recognition of a thing that had been inevitable working its way through to completion. Victor's departure wasn't an ending. It was a consequence. There was a difference. The 2 other facilities, Ethan said, the ones with variants of the same architecture. Hartwell's team is reviewing both. I've been in contact with both facility directors. The situation at Black Mesa it's made a certain kind of conversation easier to have. People are paying attention to what they'd been not paying attention to. Are the humanitarian protocols intact in those buildings? One of them was modified the same way Black Mesa's was. The other wasn't. It's still running the original automatic override, which means someone at that facility either pushed back on the modification or it just wasn't prioritized. She looked at him. We're finding out which. He drank his coffee. It was better than hotel conference room coffee typically was. I want to ask you something, Rebecca said, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is complicated. All right? When you built the unauthorized protocol into the base layer, the one that activated Thursday night, she held his gaze. Were you certain it would work, or were you trusting that it would? He sat with the question. It was a good question, the kind that went underneath the technical facts to something more fundamental about the nature of what he'd done. Both, he said. I was certain about the logic. I tested it extensively against sandbox environments. The architecture was sound, and I knew it was sound because I built it, and I understand how I build things. He paused. But I was trusting that the conditions it was designed to respond to wouldn't be more complex than I'd modeled, that the real-world failure mode would match what I'd anticipated. You can test a system against simulations. You can't fully test it against reality until reality happens. And if it had failed, if the compound conditions had been different than you modeled, and the protocol had activated incorrectly, People could have been hurt. The doors could have done the wrong thing at the wrong time. He didn't look away from her. I knew that. I built it anyway because the alternative, no protocol, Victor's manual override requirement, the conditions I could see accumulating, that failure mode was more certain and more likely than the one I was worried about. You made a probabilistic judgment. Yes. With other people's lives as the stakes. Yes. He set his coffee down. I also filed 8 months of reports trying to get someone with authority to make a different choice so I wouldn't have to make that one. The probabilistic judgment I made in February when I built the protocol was a last resort, not a first instinct. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. She wasn't challenging him. She was evaluating something, turning it over, the way she did when she was being genuinely careful rather than performing care. I believe you, she said. He hadn't known until she said it that he needed her to. The company needs to rebuild, Rebecca continued. What happened Thursday night is going to be public eventually. It's probably already moving through channels we can't control. The federal review, the compliance fraud, the circumstances of Thursday's incident. It's going to come out, and when it does, Black Mesa is going to have to account for itself in ways that are going to be uncomfortable and necessary. She straightened slightly. I want to rebuild it correctly. Not just restore the operation, actually correct what was wrong. What does that look like? That's partly what I need to talk to you about. She opened the folder on the table in front of her, the first time she'd touched it since he'd sat down. I want to create a formal whistleblower protection structure. Actual protection, not the kind that exists on paper and gets quietly circumvented. I want an independent safety review function that reports to the board, not to the security chief. I want proper attribution practices for engineering work. The culture of collective credit that erases individual authors needs to end. She looked at him. And I want the security system documentation corrected to accurately reflect who built what. He was quiet for a moment. The system documentation. Your authorship of the humanitarian protocol architecture. The original design. All of it. She met his eyes. I can't undo the fact that Victor took credit for it. I can correct the record going forward, and I can make sure the correction is public and formal. He thought about the revision log he'd found on a terminal in a decommissioned server room 3 years ago, in the cold and the faint smell of old electronics, the document that had started all of this. His name, replaced. His logic, reattributed. The specific feeling of seeing your work in someone else's signature. I want Diane Chen's name on the air handling report, he said. That's not negotiable. Already done. I reached out to her yesterday. She's going to be acknowledged formally in the compliance review documents. Rebecca paused. She cried. I didn't know what to do with that. She worked hard on that report, Ethan said simply. I know, I read it. Another pause. It was a good report. He looked at the folder. What else is in there? A proposal for a technical leadership role, Director of Systems Integrity. It's a new position, reporting directly to me, with authority over safety compliance review across all facilities and mandate to conduct independent audits. She slid one page toward him. The title is provisional. The scope and compensation are negotiable. What's not negotiable is the independence of the function. He picked up the page. Read it. Put it back down. I'm in the middle of a federal review, he said. I know. The role would begin whenever your legal situation is resolved. I'm not asking you to decide today. I'm asking you to know that it's being offered. He looked at the proposal, at the title, the scope, the line that said reports directly to CEO, operationally independent of security division. You built the wrong power structure, he said. Victor had too much authority over too many things without enough check on any of them. Yes. This structure you're proposing, the system's integrity role, the independent safety function, it only works if the person in it has genuine authority to say no, not advisory authority, actual stop-the-line authority. I understand that. And if they say no and it costs the company money or a contract or an embarrassing moment in front of federal clients, the structure has to hold. Yes. She met his eyes steadily. I understand that, Ethan. I understand it because I've seen what happens when the structure doesn't hold. He believed her. Not because she'd been right before. She hadn't been. Not about this. but because the way she was sitting across from him now was different from every other conversation he'd had with her. The careful composure was still there, but it was over something different than it used to be. Before, it had been over certainty. The certainty of a CEO who believes she has the full picture and is managing it competently. Now it was over something humbler. The composure of a person who has been wrong about something important and is trying to be right about what comes next. That was harder and more honest and worth more. "I'll read the full proposal," he said. "After the review." "That's all I'm asking." He stood. She stood. They shook hands across the hotel conference table, which felt slightly formal given everything, but also right in its way. The beginning of something that was going to require formality to hold its shape. "One more thing," he said. "Yes." Marcus Webb. The maintenance flag he filed on sub-level 5, twice, internally, both times bumped. His file should reflect that he identified the fault and flagged it through proper channels. Whatever happened after that wasn't his failure. "It's already noted in the review documentation." She paused. "He also told Hartwell's team about calling you the night of the incident, about giving you the access code." "I know. He was upfront about it." "His position is secure. I've made that clear to HR." She looked at him. "He stood up when it was hard." "He stood up when it cost something," Ethan said. "That's different and better." He left the hotel and walked to his car in the gray November afternoon. The review had been running for 4 days. Constance Park had submitted an initial legal filing that framed the unauthorized protocol in the context of the compliance fraud it had helped expose, and Hartwell's office had acknowledged receipt without indicating direction. There were more conversations to come. More rooms, more careful language, more people deciding how to characterize a thing that didn't fit cleanly into their standard categories. He drove to the hardware store on the way home because the kitchen faucet had been dripping for 2 weeks, and he'd been meaning to get washers. He stood in the plumbing aisle for a few minutes locating the right size, which required looking at 3 different packages and comparing them to a photograph he'd taken of the existing fittings before he left the house. This was the kind of task that his former schedule had converted into a thing that didn't happen, that slid from week to week on an internal list until the drip was audible from the hallway. He found the right washers. He bought them. He fixed the faucet that evening after dinner on his back under the sink with a flashlight and a wrench, Lily sitting on the kitchen floor beside the cabinet doing her homework with the naturalness of a child who finds it unremarkable to do homework next to a parent wedged under a sink. "How's it going under there?" she said at one point. "It's going." "Did you find the problem?" "The washer was worn. Simple fix." "Is it always that simple?" "No," he said, "but when it is, it's satisfying." She turned a page. He tightened the fitting. The drip stopped. The following 3 weeks had a texture different from the weeks that had preceded them. The federal review moved. Hartwell's team was thorough in the way that official processes are when they found something real and are no longer fighting the current. Forward motion, document requests met with documents, interviews scheduled and conducted. Findings accumulating in the methodical rhythm of accountability doing its actual work. Ethan was interviewed twice, once by Hartwell's team directly, once by a secondary reviewer from a federal attorney's office who was specifically focused on the unauthorized protocol question. Constance Park was present for both. She let Ethan speak, which was her way of telling him she trusted his account to be its own best argument, and she intervened precisely when she needed to, which was twice, both times on questions of legal characterization rather than factual description. The secondary reviewer was a young man named Garrett, who had the look of someone good at his job trying not to appear too comfortable being good at his job in front of people who'd been doing it longer than him. He asked good questions. He listened carefully to the answers. At the end of the second interview, he said, "The dead man's switch, the 180-day confirmation window, you built that into the protocol." "Yes." "Why?" Ethan looked at him. "Because I knew there was a possibility I wouldn't be there to run it. And I thought, if I'm not there, and the conditions I've been warning about occur, someone needs to have built the response into the structure before I left. Not a call to make in the moment, not a decision that requires someone's authorization, something already decided, already there, waiting to be needed." Garrett wrote something, looked up. You built it, assuming your own absence. Yes. That's... He paused, seemed to choose a different word than the one he'd been about to use. That's a specific kind of professional foresight. It's what the job required, Ethan said. In the hallway afterward, Constance said, that answer was good. It was true. Sometimes those are the same thing. She tucked her notepad under her arm. Garrett is filing his preliminary findings next week. I've had a conversation with his office. The unauthorized modification is going to be characterized, and this is preliminary, as unauthorized but mitigating circumstance dense. They're looking at it in the context of the compliance fraud, the suppressed safety reports, and the documented failure of internal remediation channels. What does that mean practically? It means they're not recommending prosecution. It means there may be a formal censure, a documented acknowledgement that what you did was outside authorized parameters, even given the circumstances. And it means the full context goes into the federal record, which is public. I can live with a censure. I thought you might say that. She looked at him. Most clients would be angling for a complete exoneration. The ends justified the means argument. The ends don't justify the means. I made a decision outside my authority because I believed it was necessary, and I accepted that the decision carried consequences. Both things are true. Constance studied him for a moment. You're a difficult client, she said. In the good way. Thrasin. Victor Kane's formal separation from Black Mesa was announced publicly in the 4th week. The press release was careful. Corporate press releases are always careful. But the underlying facts were visible enough through the language that anyone paying attention could read them. Irregularities in compliance documentation, modifications to safety protocols without proper authorization, ongoing cooperation with federal review. The regional business publication that had mentioned the November demonstration in its contract pipeline story ran a follow-up piece. Ethan didn't read it the day it came out. He read it 3 days later when Marcus texted him a link with no comment, and he sat with it for a while. The piece was accurate in its facts and incomplete in its texture, which is the standard condition of journalism about events that are more complex than the space available to describe them. It mentioned the unauthorized protocol. It mentioned Ethan by name. It mentioned that 18 workers had been on sublevels when the blast door lockdown occurred, and all 18 had reached the surface. It did not mention Torres. Ethan noted that and flagged it to Marcus, who said he'd pass it along to Torres, who reportedly said, "Good, I don't want to be in a newspaper," which seemed right. Diane Chen called him the day after the article ran. He hadn't spoken to her since the night he'd called Audrey Weston, weeks before everything happened. "I saw the piece," she said. "Yeah?" "It mentioned the air handling report. Rebecca told me she corrected your attribution." "She did?" A pause. "She called me herself. Apologized. Offered me a consulting position reviewing the Sublevel 2 air systems." Another pause. "I said I'd think about it." "Woo, you should take it," Ethan said. "I haven't decided yet." "Fair enough." She was quiet for a moment. "You know what I kept thinking after everything? After I heard what happened?" "What?" "That night I called you, before the demonstration. I said I kept copies of the air handling reports in case it ever mattered." She stopped. "I spent 2 years thinking maybe it was pointless, that I'd been overreacting, that the reports were just paperwork for a problem that had been handled. It wasn't pointless. No, it turns out it really wasn't." She let out a breath that had something complicated in it. Relief, maybe, mixed with the particular sadness of people who were right about hard things for a long time before anyone listened. "I'm glad you built what you built, Ethan." "I'm glad Torres moved his people," Ethan said. "And I'm glad you kept your copies." After he hung up, he sat in his home office for a few minutes. The fireproof lockbox was back in the closet, behind the box of Lily's school projects. The encrypted drive was in his desk drawer. Constance had advised him to keep it accessible, as it remained part of the review documentation. He looked at the drive for a moment. Then he got up and went to the kitchen to start dinner. The evening after the formal censure document arrived, a 7-page document from the federal attorney's office, formal and measured and placing the full context on record alongside the acknowledgement that the protocol had been installed without authorization, Lily found it on the kitchen table while Ethan was on the phone. He came back into the kitchen to find her reading it with the careful attention she brought to things she thought were important. He sat down across from her, waited. She turned the last page, set it down. It says you did something unauthorized. Yeah. And that it was wrong, but the situation was complicated. That's the simplified version, but yeah. She looked at the document. Are you in trouble? No. This is the end of it, legally. The censure is the formal consequence. No prosecution, no civil liability. But they wrote down that you did something wrong. They wrote down that I did something outside my authorization, which is true, I did, to save people. That doesn't make it automatically okay. He watched her face. I want you to understand that. The fact that it worked out, that people are safe, that the protocol did what I built it to do, that doesn't mean the way I did it was unquestionable. I made a judgment call that I wasn't authorized to make. I had good reasons, and I'd make the same call again, but there are real questions about what it means for one person to decide to override the system because they believe they're right. She looked at him steadily. What if they are right? Sometimes they are, but sometimes people who do unauthorized things also think they're right, and they're not. The authorization structure exists because you can't always know from inside which kind you are. So how do you know? He thought about that, about the server room in the cold, about 8 months of reports, about Torres's voice on the radio, level and professional, telling 6 people to move. You do everything the authorized way first, he said. Everything. You use every channel available to you, and if all of them have been blocked or corrupted or ignored and you're looking at a specific harm to specific people that you can prevent, then you make the call, and you own it, and you document it, and you accept whatever comes from it. She looked at the document again, then at him. You owned it. Yes. And this is what came from it. This is what came from it. She pushed the document back toward him, not dismissively, with a kind of deliberateness that meant she'd processed it, and was returning it to him as something that was his to carry. Okay, she said. Okay? I understand it. She got up to get a glass of water. It's not simple, but I understand it. He looked at the document on the kitchen table. 7 pages of careful federal language wrapping around a complicated human act and doing its best to make it legible. It was not wrong, the document. It was also not complete. Nothing that goes on paper ever fully is. He folded it and put it in the fireproof box the following morning, alongside the encrypted drive and the original protocol documentation and the 43 pages of evidence and the photographs from the server room on sublevel 3. Alongside the parallel records and the fault logs and the revision timestamps and everything else he'd carried for 3 years. He locked the box. He put it back behind Lily's school projects and closed the closet. The day Rebecca called to tell him the system's integrity position was formally ready and waiting for his acceptance, it was the 2nd week of December. Lily was in her last week before winter break. There was a Christmas tree in the living room that they'd decorated on a Saturday with old ornaments and new lights, and an argument about where the star went that had resolved when Lily climbed on the step stool and put it on herself, effectively settling the matter. Ethan was in the kitchen when the call came. He stood at the counter with the phone in one hand and looked at the tree visible through the doorway. The lights doing their quiet, persistent work in the corner of the living room. The star exactly where Lily had put it, which was slightly to the left of center and somehow more right-looking than center would have been. It's ready, Rebecca said. Whenever you are. He thought about what Constance had said, about clients who wanted complete exoneration. He thought about what he'd said back. The ends don't justify the means. And about whether he'd meant it, and he was certain that he had. He also thought about Hartwell's team, currently reviewing a second Black Mesa facility where the humanitarian override had been suppressed the same way it had been suppressed at the main building. Workers going underground there too, in a building with a system that had been quietly made less safe. Nobody had built a conscience into that one's foundation. Not yet. I have conditions, he said. I assumed you would. He could hear something in her voice, not amusement exactly, but close. The sound of a person who has come to understand someone well enough to anticipate them. Tell me. Formal whistleblower protection, not a policy memo. A structural change with teeth, independent reporting channel, independent review body, binding non-retaliation provisions. Agreed. Engineering authorship protocol. Mandatory attribution, documented and enforced. No more collective credit that erases individual contributors. Agreed. HR is already drafting it. The system's integrity role has genuine stop-the-line authority, not advisory, not significant input into. Stop the line. I'm prepared to put it in writing. Life first standard. In any conflict between security posture and human safety in the sub-level systems, the tie goes to life, not to the contract, not to the demonstration schedule, not to the federal client in the presentation room. Yes, he paused, and I want to go back to the second facility, the one where the protocol was suppressed. Before I do anything else at Black Mesa, I want to go there and assess the system myself. A pause on her end. That's not technically within the scope of the system's integrity role as currently written. Then rewrite it. Another pause. Shorter this time. All right, I'll rewrite it. He looked at the tree, the lights, the star, slightly left of center. Okay, he said. I'll come back. When? After the new year. Lily has winter break, and I want to be present for it. Of course. A pause. Ethan. Yeah. Thank you. He thought about what to say to that, and what he settled on was simple because simple was right. Get the second facility assessed before anyone goes underground there again. Already in process, Rebecca said. Hartwell's team is on site. Good. He moved to hang up, then stopped. One more thing. Yes? Marcus Webb. When you're building the new safety review function, he has the instincts and the documentation habits and the willingness to flag things when it costs him something to flag them. Whatever the new structure looks like, he should be part of it. A brief pause. I'll talk to him. Don't offer him something ceremonial. Offer him something real. I understand the difference now, she said quietly. He believed her. Well, the afternoon before Lily's winter break began, Ethan drove to the Black Mesa facility. Not to go in. He didn't have credentials yet, and the terms of his return hadn't been formally executed. He just drove out there the way you sometimes go back to a place to look at it from the outside, to see what it looks like when you're not inside it. He parked in the main lot this time, not the service lot blind spot. The main lot, where the cameras were working and the signage was visible, and he sat in his car in the December afternoon with the engine off. The building looked the same from the outside. Dark glass, concrete, the long approach that was supposed to make you feel small, the ventilation stack on the left face, 6 inches taller than the plans, the correction he'd caught in the third revision. The amber lights were gone. The humanitarian protocol had transitioned to standby after the night of the demonstration. Once the administrative layer had been properly unlocked and the egress confirmation had been formally completed. The building was back to normal operational lighting, the same dark glass face it had always had. But somewhere in its foundation, below the security framework and the administrative layer and all the visible infrastructure of a building designed to communicate power, the protocol was there, passive, dormant, watching, not waiting to be needed, just there in case it was. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. Then he started the car and drove to pick up Lily from school. She came out in her yellow raincoat, the broken zipper, the cartoon animal patches along the collar that she still refused to replace. She walked toward his car without looking around for him first, because she knew where he'd be. He was always in the same spot in the pickup line, left side, 3 cars from the front. She got in, dropped her backpack at her feet, looked at him. You went to the building, she said. Just looked at it from outside. And? It's still there. She seemed to consider whether this was a satisfying answer. That's not really what I was asking. I know. He pulled out of the pickup line. It looks like a building. From the outside, it always just looks like a building. But it's not just a building. No, he said. It's not. She looked out the window. The December light was thin and clean, the particular quality of afternoon light in the cold months when the sky doesn't fully commit to darkness until the day's been over for a while. Are you really going back? She said. After the new year, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Are you sure? He thought about the second facility, the workers there, the suppressed protocol, the building that didn't have a conscience built into its foundation yet. "Yeah," he said. "I'm sure." She turned back from the window. "Okay." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a drawing. She'd been working on it for a few days, he knew, at the kitchen table in the evenings. She unrolled it and held it up. It was the building again, more detailed than ever. She'd been getting better all year, and it showed in the precision of the lines, the shading on the concrete, the careful rendering of the glass, the long approach with its deliberate distance, and the doors, all of them, every one, open. She'd drawn them in a light she'd mixed herself from multiple colored pencils, not amber, not green, something in between. Something that wasn't a warning and wasn't normal and was its own specific thing that didn't have a name yet. He looked at the drawing. "The light's different," he said. "I know. I couldn't decide between the colors, so I used both." She looked at it. "I think it looks better this way. More honest." He drove, and she held the drawing, and the December afternoon did what December afternoons do. Held the light as long as it could, and then let it go. Winter break lasted 11 days, and Ethan was present for all of them in the specific way he hadn't managed to be present for previous ones. Not physically present, which he'd usually managed, but actually there. Not carrying the weight of the next report to file, or the next channel to exhaust, or the particular vigilance of a man watching a slow disaster approach from a distance he couldn't close. The disaster had arrived and resolved. The vigilance had somewhere else to be now. They did things that didn't matter and mattered completely. They went to a movie on a Tuesday afternoon because Tuesday afternoon movies have a specific quality of freedom that weekend movies don't. The theater mostly empty, the whole thing feeling slightly stolen from ordinary time. Lily chose something he would not have chosen, and he was glad she did. They made cookies from a recipe her fourth-grade teacher had sent home, which produced cookies that were slightly flat and extremely good. They drove 40 minutes on a clear December day to a state park where the trails were mostly empty and the light came through the bare trees and long, pale columns, and Lily found a piece of quartz that she put in her coat pocket and carried home. They didn't talk about Black Mesa much. Not because it was off limits. Nothing was off limits between them. That had always been their arrangement, even when the things not being limited were complicated, but because the break was the break, and Ethan had learned in the 11 days of it that stepping back from the thing you've been straining toward for a long time is its own kind of skill. You have to let the tension out slowly, or it snaps back and takes something with it. On the last evening of the break, he sat at the kitchen table after Lily had gone to bed and looked at the systems integrity proposal Rebecca had sent him 3 weeks ago. He'd read it 4 times already. He read it a 5th time now, slowly, paying attention to the places where the language was precise and the places where it was slightly vague, which are always different places and both require equal attention. The stop-the-line authority was there, written clearly. The Director of Systems Integrity shall have unilateral authority to halt any operational activity pending safety review, with said authority not subject to override by any division head or operational director. Rebecca had kept her word. The language was unambiguous. The whistleblower protection structure was there, not a policy memo but a structural change with an independent reporting channel routed directly to the board's audit committee, bypassing the operational chain entirely. That had taken longer to draft than the other provisions because it required bylaw amendments, which required board approval, which Rebecca had gotten in a special session in mid-December. He knew because she'd sent him the board minutes. Diane Chen's formal attribution was in the supplementary documentation. Her name on the air handling report entered into the permanent engineering record with a note about the circumstances of the original suppression that was matter-of-fact and unsparing. He signed the proposal at 11:05 p.m., scanned it, emailed it to Rebecca, and copied Constance Park. Then he made himself a cup of tea and sat in the quiet kitchen and thought about what he was walking back into and whether he was ready for it, which were 2 different questions that deserved honest, separate answers. What he was walking back into, a company in the process of genuine restructuring, which was different from a company performing restructuring, though the difference would take time to fully establish. A federal review still in progress at the second facility. A security system that needed its full documentation corrected and its compliance records reconciled and its sub-level infrastructure brought up to the standard it should have met 3 years ago. A culture that had normalized looking away from uncomfortable technical facts when the facts inconvenienced important timelines. And cultures don't change because someone writes a new policy. They change because enough people make enough different choices over enough time that the pattern eventually becomes the new normal. Was he ready for it? He thought about that question honestly, which meant acknowledging that ready was probably the wrong word. He wasn't ready in the sense of having resolved every doubt or answered every question about whether it could work. He was ready in the sense that he understood what the work was and believed it mattered and didn't have a better use for his particular knowledge and capacity than doing it. That was enough. Enough had always been the standard, not perfect. He drank his tea. The kitchen was quiet. On the refrigerator, Lily's drawing, the one with the light that was neither amber nor green, held its place under the lighthouse magnet. He went to bed. He started at Black Mesa on the second Monday of January. His first act was not ceremonial. He didn't make a speech or take a tour or accept a welcome from the executive team, all of which Rebecca had offered and all of which he'd declined. His first act was to go to Sublevel 5 Eastern Corridor with Torres, who had agreed to be his guide through the infrastructure work that had been completed in the 6 weeks since the November incident, and look at the new relay. The new relay had been installed the day after the demonstration, sourced on emergency procurement from a supplier Torres had located at 7 a.m. the morning after the incident. It was the correct generation for the Sublevel 5 distribution architecture, and it was installed correctly, and Torres had documented every step of the installation in a log that was precise enough to be its own kind of argument against the kind of cutting corners that had brought the old relay to its failure point. Ethan crouched in front of the panel and looked at the installation. Then he looked at Torres. "Good work," he said. "It's how it should have been done the first time." "Yes." He stood. "What's the current status of the hydraulic lines on levels 3 through 5? "Replaced in December. Full run, both corridors. Budget was approved by Rebecca directly. She bypassed the normal procurement timeline." Torres handed him a folder. "Pressure readings since replacement, all within spec." Ethan took the folder, looked at the readings. They were clean, genuinely clean, not clean adjacent or within tolerance if you squint, but accurately spec'd and functioning as they should. It was the particular satisfaction of seeing a system in the state it was supposed to be in, the way a properly set bone looks different on the scan from a badly healed one. "The air handling on Sub 2, he said, "repaired the week after the incident. The pressure differential is gone." Torres paused. Diane Chen came in for 2 days to review the repair work. Rebecca asked her to. Ethan looked at him. "How was that?" Torres almost smiled. "She found one thing the repair team missed. Minor. Nothing like the original problem. She flagged it, they fixed it, she signed off on the system." He paused. "She's good." "Yes," Ethan said. "She is." They walked the eastern corridor from end to end, the full run that Hendricks had been at the far end of on the night of the demonstration. The corridor was 94 meters. He walked it at a normal pace, and it took him 1 minute and 12 seconds, which was faster than Torres's 4-minute estimate for Hendricks, because Hendricks had been moving equipment and hadn't initially understood the urgency of the radio call. He stood at the far end of the corridor and looked back toward the access stairwell. 1 minute, 12 seconds at a walk. 90 meters of corridor with blast doors that had been locked. He thought about Hendricks, whom he'd never met, who had a 6-month-old at home and had been at this end of this corridor and had made it to the stairwell with 30 seconds to spare because Torres had made a call and 6 people had moved. He thought about all the other things that could have been different. Torres not having his radio, the call not going through, the stairwell door reaching lockdown a minute earlier. He thought about all the parallel versions of November 13th, where the weight came down differently. Then he stopped thinking about them, because you can drive yourself into the ground with parallel versions. The version that happened was the one that mattered, and in the version that happened, everyone came up. He walked back to the stairwell. "Let's look at the Sub-3 Western Corridor," he said. "I want to see the door sensor installation from the night of the incident." Torres led him there. The first full week back had the quality of something being built rather than restored. That distinction mattered to Ethan in ways he couldn't entirely articulate, but felt clearly in the difference between coming in every morning to fix a broken thing and coming in every morning to build something that hadn't fully existed before. The system's integrity function was new enough that it had no precedent in the company's operational history, which was both a difficulty and a freedom. There was no prior version of it to be compared to, no established expectation of what it looked like in practice, no institutional memory of how it handled conflicts with division leadership. He was making the shape of the thing as he went, which required the specific combination of patience and persistence that he'd always found easier than most people seemed to, probably because he'd been doing it his whole career, building systems from foundational logic upward, making decisions about structure before worrying about surface. He hired 2 people in the first month. The first was a systems auditor named Priya Delacroix, whom he'd known by reputation for 6 years and who had the methodical quality of someone who finds genuine satisfaction in making records match reality. She came from a medical device testing background, which turned out to be exactly the right preparation. Medical device testing produces people who understand that the gap between what a system is documented to do and what it actually does can be the difference between someone being fine and someone not being fine, and that understanding sits in the body differently than it sits in the head. The second was a recent engineering graduate named James Okafor, who was 24 and had applied for a standard systems technician role and whose application Ethan had pulled from the regular stack because of a note in his cover letter. 1 sentence, almost a throwaway. I believe safety engineering is not a specialty within a field, but a perspective that should run through every decision in the field. Ethan had read that sentence twice and then called him directly. Okafor had been surprised to get the call from the Director of Systems Integrity, rather than HR. He'd been more surprised by the conversation, which was less an interview than an extended technical discussion about failure mode analysis and the difference between documented safety and actual safety. At the end of an hour, Ethan had offered him a role as a junior systems integrity analyst. That's not what I applied for, Okafor said. No, Ethan said. It's better. Okafor started the following Monday. Marcus, as Ethan had requested, was brought into the new safety review function in a formal capacity. Not a title change exactly, but a documented role as a senior technical consultant to the systems integrity team, with authority to file safety concerns directly to Ethan's office with a guaranteed response window of 48 hours. It was the structure that would have changed everything 3 years ago if it had existed then. It existed now. Marcus came to Ethan's office on his first day in the new role and stood in the doorway with an expression that was trying to be casual and wasn't quite managing it. This is a real thing, Marcus said. Not ceremonial. Not ceremonial. I can actually flag anything you see in the monitoring systems and it comes directly to me. Yes, that's how it works. Marcus looked at the office. At the desk that was already covered in documentation because Ethan had been at Black Mesa for 3 weeks, and the documentation had a way of expanding to fill available surfaces. At the drawing Lily had made, the new one, the one with the light that was both colors, which Ethan had taped to the wall beside the window. You put her drawing up, Marcus said. Yeah. Marcus looked at it for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the way you nod at things that are right in a way that doesn't need commentary. He went back to his station. The second facility review concluded in mid-February. The facility was called Harrow Point. It was in a different city, operated by a Black Mesa subsidiary under a separate contract, and it had the same fundamental security architecture as the main building because it had been designed by the same team, which in practice meant Ethan's original design running under the same kind of administrative revision layer that had been applied at the main building. Hartwell's team had been on site since November. Ethan went there twice during the review, once in January to assess the base layer architecture with a member of Hartwell's technical staff, and once in early February when the findings were being compiled and the facility director, a man named Samuels who had inherited the post from a predecessor who'd made the compliance modifications without fully understanding their implications, wanted a direct conversation about what the remediation would look like. The humanitarian protocol at Harrow Point had been modified the same way. Manual authorization requirement substituted for the automatic override, the same administrative revision, the same compliance documentation that referenced a surface facility standard rather than an underground one. The modification had been made 16 months ago. Since then, the facility had run 3 demonstration events for federal clients with workers below grade and blast doors in demonstration lockdown mode, and nothing catastrophic had occurred, which was the exact combination of conditions that makes people believe a risk doesn't exist. The risk existed. Ethan spent 4 days at Harrow Point in February. He went into the sub-levels with Harrow Point's senior technician, a careful woman named Bellows, who had the specific quality of someone who has always known something was wrong in her environment, but hasn't had the language to name it precisely. When Ethan showed her the base layer architecture, the foundation of the system, the layer below the administrative revisions, she went quiet in the way people go quiet when they see something that recontextualizes a lot of what they already knew. "This was always here," she said. "Yes." "Below the revision?" "Yes." She looked at the diagnostic display. "It's still in passive monitor mode. The dead man switch, it expired?" "The primary author confirmation lapsed when I left the main facility. The protocol here is running on a passive trigger only. It would activate if the compound failure conditions occurred, but there's been no confirmation maintenance." He paused. "I need to run the reauthorization sequence to put it back under active management." "You can do that?" "Yes, it's part of what I came here to do." He ran the reauthorization sequence that afternoon. The protocol returned to its properly managed state, passive standby, under active confirmation maintenance, with the new authorization credentials he'd established under the system's integrity role at Black Mesa. Both facilities now running correctly, both foundations intact. He stood in the foundation access corridor at Harrow Point afterward and thought about the fact that there were other facilities, other buildings with underground zones, other security systems built on frameworks derived from the same original architecture, other places where the distance between the documented version of a system and its actual operational state might be wider than anyone was currently measuring. He thought about that problem the whole drive back. It wasn't the kind of problem that resolved in a single action or a single role at a single company. It was the kind of problem that took a long time and required people at multiple levels to make different choices than they'd been making. And it had no clean endpoint, just a direction. He was okay with that. He'd spent enough time on problems with clean endpoints to understand that the problems worth spending your life on usually don't have them. The formal public correction of the engineering record came in March. Rebecca had been building toward it since January. A formal company statement, reviewed by Hartwell's office and the federal attorney's team, that corrected the attribution record for the Black Mesa Security System's core architecture. The statement named Ethan as the primary author of the system's foundational design, including the humanitarian emergency protocol, the base layer decision tree, and the audit function. It documented the circumstances of the attribution revision, Victor's office, the timeline, the mechanisms, without legal editorializing that the review process hadn't yet formally concluded. It also named Diane Chen as the author of the Sublevel 2 Air Handling Assessment Report, with a formal acknowledgement that the original suppression of the report had been improper. Ethan read the statement before it was released and made 2 editorial changes, both minor, both about precision rather than substance. The statement was accurate. That was what mattered. He was in his office when it went out. He didn't watch the response in real time. He turned his monitor away from his email and worked on the sub-level infrastructure assessment he'd been building for both facilities, which was the kind of work that required the kind of concentration that news cycles interrupt. He worked until noon, then ate lunch at his desk, then kept working. Marcus came to his office at 2 p.m. "You haven't read any of it," Marcus said. "I'll read it tonight." Diane Chen posted something. Ethan looked up. "On the engineering forum she's on, about the attribution correction." Marcus leaned against the doorframe. She talked about what it felt like to have the work credited to someone else. Not bitterly, just honestly. He paused. A lot of people are responding to it. Other engineers, people who recognize the specific feeling she's describing. Ethan thought about that, about the specific feeling, the experience of building something and watching it become someone else's, the way that kind of erasure works on a person over time, quiet and corrosive. "Good," he said. That she said it. That people are recognizing it. Someone in the thread linked to your censure document. The federal one, Marcus said it carefully. Some people are saying you should have been prosecuted, that the unauthorized protocol was an overreach regardless of the outcome. Ethan looked at his desk, at the infrastructure assessment, at the numbers that described the state of the systems he was responsible for and the work that still needed to be done in both of them. They're not entirely wrong, he said. Marcus frowned. You saved 18 people. I also made a unilateral decision to modify a federal contractor facility's security infrastructure based on my own assessment that it was necessary. Those two facts coexist. He met Marcus's eyes. The people saying it was an overreach are engaging with a real question. What I did worked out. That doesn't close the question of whether the doing of it was right. Does it matter? Whether it was right? The people are alive. It matters because next time someone's going to say, Mercer did it and it worked as a justification for doing something unauthorized that might not work. The question of what makes my situation different from that one is worth being able to answer. Marcus was quiet for a moment. What's the answer? Documentation, good faith exhaustion of authorized channels, minimum necessary intervention, full disclosure of what you did and why. He paused. And a lot of luck. I built the protocol correctly, and the failure mode matched what I'd modeled, and the people moved when Torres told them to, and Hartwell picked up the phone. Any one of those going differently, and we're having a different conversation. But they didn't go differently. No, Ethan said. They didn't. And I'm glad every day that they didn't. He looked out the office window. The view was of an interior courtyard, nothing remarkable, but the light in it was good in the afternoons. That's not the same as saying luck was the plan. Marcus absorbed this in the way he absorbed most things Ethan said. Not immediately agreeing, not pushing back, just taking it in and letting it settle. You should read Diane's post, he said finally. Not for the response, just what she wrote. It's worth reading. Ethan read it that evening, at home, after dinner. Lily was upstairs doing homework, and he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and found Diane's post in the engineering forum through the link Marcus had texted him. She'd written about building the air handling assessment over 8 months, about the specific satisfaction of that kind of work, the accumulation of data, the pattern becoming visible, the moment when you understand the system well enough to see where it's wrong and know how to say it clearly, about submitting the report and receiving the acknowledgement, and then the silence that meant nothing formal was happening. About taking her copies and leaving and spending 2 years thinking maybe she'd been wrong to make it a thing she held on to. She wrote, I wasn't wrong, I just didn't know yet whether holding on mattered. Turns out it did. I don't know how to feel about the 2 years in between, honestly. I'm still figuring that out. But I know that the report was right, and the data was real, and someone eventually read it who understood what it was saying, and that has to be enough for the 2 years to have been worth it. He sat with that for a while. 2 years of not knowing if holding on mattered. He'd had 3. He understood what she was describing. Not the glamorized version of persistence, the kind that shows up in stories as a clean narrative arc from doubt to vindication, but the actual experience of it, which was mostly unglamorous and frequently exhausting, and punctuated by long stretches of genuine uncertainty about whether you were the person who was right or the person who couldn't let go of being right, and those two things can be difficult to distinguish from the inside. He thought about the fireproof box in his closet, about the habit of documentation, the notebooks, the parallel records, the photographs from a server room, the 43 pages. He thought about the specific discipline of continuing to write things down when the writing seemed to be going nowhere. There was a kind of faith in that, he realized. Not the kind that gets named in churches or ceremonies, the quieter kind. The faith that what is true will eventually be findable if someone has been patient enough to document it. The faith that the gap between the official record and the real record doesn't stay open forever if someone keeps making the real record visible. It required patience he didn't always feel. It required the willingness to be wrong or to be right in ways nobody was ready to use yet. It required building things for a future that might not include you. He'd done all of it. He'd done it badly some of the time, and well, other times. And in one significant instance, he'd done it in a way that was outside his authority and had understood as he did it that this fact would be part of the record too. He didn't regret it. He also didn't pretend it was simple. He closed the laptop and washed the few dishes from dinner and stood at the kitchen window for a moment. The backyard was dark. In the spring, he and Lily had talked about planting something out there. She wanted tomatoes. He thought herb beds made more practical sense. They hadn't resolved it. They would. These were the kind of arguments that resolved themselves eventually through the application of available ground and accumulated enthusiasm. What? The day that stayed with him came in April, 6 weeks into his official role, on an unremarkable Tuesday morning. He was in his office reviewing the preliminary findings from Priya's audit of the system documentation, cross-referencing her notes against the original design specs, when his desk phone rang. The desk phone almost never rang. Most communication happened through email or his cell or in person, and the unfamiliarity of the sound made him pause before picking up. It was Hendrix. He knew the name, but they'd never spoken. She was one of Torres's 6, the one who'd been at the far end of the sub-5 Eastern corridor, the one with the 6-month-old at home. He didn't know how she'd gotten his direct line. He found out later that Torres had given it to her. "I wanted to call," she said. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite comfortable. The sound of someone who has been thinking about making a call for a long time and has finally made it and is now in the part they didn't fully script. "I heard you were back. I wanted to... I don't know. Thank you, I guess, for what you built." "You don't need to thank me." "I know I don't need to. I wanted to." A pause. "I found out..." Torres told me, eventually, how close it was. The timing. I didn't know at first. I thought it was just a drill. "I know. My daughter is 8 months now." She stopped. Started again. "I'm not trying to be dramatic about it. I just wanted to say it to someone who understood what happened that night. That she exists, and I'm here, and that's because of a system you built. In the foundation, years before." Ethan sat in his office chair with the desk phone against his ear and the morning light coming through the window at the angle it came through on clear April mornings, bright and specific, the kind of light that makes dust visible in the air and makes everything look slightly more present than usual. "Her name is Cora," Hendrix said. He didn't say anything for a moment. "That's a good name," he said finally. "Yeah." She seemed to relax slightly, the thing she'd been braced for having resolved into something manageable. "Okay, I wanted to say it. You didn't have to pick up. I'm glad you called." After he hung up, he sat in the office for a while without doing anything in particular. He thought about Hendrix and the 8-month-old named Cora and the 90 meters of corridor and 30 seconds and the specific contingency of everything. All the small decisions that had run in the right direction on a night when they could have run differently. He thought about what it meant to build something for people you'd never meet. Not just professionally. He'd always understood that part, that engineers build for users they don't know, that the work has implications beyond your own sightlines. But more specifically than that, he'd built the humanitarian protocol thinking about abstract maintenance workers in hypothetical failure scenarios. What he hadn't been able to anticipate was that one of them would be named Hendrix, with a daughter who would later be 8 months old and named Cora, calling him on a Tuesday morning to say thank you. The work is always more specific than you can see when you're doing it. The faces come later, if you're lucky. Sometimes you don't get to know them at all, and the work matters just as much. But when you do get to know them, when Hendrix calls and says her daughter's name, the weight of what you were actually doing becomes fully visible in a way it wasn't before. He sat with that for a long time. Then he picked up the infrastructure assessment and kept working, because Cora's existence was the reason and the work was the thing, and the thing had a long way still to go. On a Friday in late April, Ethan walked out of Black Mesa at the end of the day to find Lily waiting in the parking lot. She'd gotten a ride with Mara's older sister, who drove and had dropped her off on the way somewhere else, and she was standing at the edge of the main parking lot in her yellow raincoat. The zipper's still broken, the patch is still there. She'd added a new one in February that was a small cartoon wrench, which she claimed was a coincidence, and he didn't believe her. With her backpack and the expression of someone who has been waiting for a reasonable amount of time and considers this acceptable. He stopped when he saw her. He'd known she was coming. She'd texted him at 3:15 saying she'd get a ride and meet him. But the specific image of her standing there at the edge of the Black Mesa parking lot, in front of the main entrance with its long glass face, was something that landed differently than he'd expected. She saw him and lifted one hand in the particular half-wave she used instead of enthusiastic greeting, the one that said, "Yes, I see you, let's proceed." He walked toward her. "How was your day?" she said, falling in beside him as he reached her. "Good, productive." He looked at her. "How was yours?" "We had a science test." She considered. "I think I did well. The question about circuits was confusing, but I think I got it right." "What was confusing about it?" She described the question as they walked, and he listened, and the conversation moved naturally through the circuit question to a broader discussion of how electrical systems were different from mechanical ones, and when you needed to think about them separately versus together, which was the kind of conversation they'd been having in various forms for most of her life, and which never felt like instruction even when it was. They reached the gate. Ethan had been walking this particular stretch of parking lot and pavement for 4 months, in and out, morning and evening, and he'd developed the kind of familiarity with a physical space that makes you stop seeing it in the normal way. It becomes backdrop, context, the setting, rather than the thing itself. He wasn't thinking about the gate, but Lily slowed as they approached it. She looked up at the mechanism, the main gate's automated arm, the reader panel, the camera housing above it. Standard installation, nothing remarkable. "This is where they walked you out," she said. It wasn't quite a question. She remembered the day clearly. She'd told him once, months ago, that she remembered everything about it, the rain and the lobby, and Victor's voice carrying in the acoustic ceiling, and the specific quality of her father's face when he decided not to say the things he could have said. "Yeah," Ethan said. She stood there for a moment, looking at the gate. The mechanism ran quietly. The arm in its standard raised for pedestrian exit position, the small LED on the reader panel showing green. "Does it feel different?" she said. "Going through it now?" He thought about the honest answer, the one that wasn't neat. "It feels like the same gate," he said, "which is the point, I think. The gate was always going to open. What changed is whether the people making decisions about the building were doing it honestly." He looked at it. "The physical thing doesn't change. The people and the choices change." She seemed to consider this. "So it's not really about the gate." "No, it never was." She nodded, slowly, doing the thing she did where she filed a thing in the part of her that kept things. Then she looked at him. "Are you glad you came back?" He thought about the honest answer to that one too, and found that it was simpler than he'd expected. "Yes," he said. "I am." "Because of the work?" "Because of the work, because of the people I'm working with, because there's something in the building that needs to keep existing, and I'm one of the people who understands how to maintain it." He paused. "And because it would have been the wrong kind of ending to walk away and let the story be that I was the man they fired, and that was all." She looked at him with the clear, specific quality she brought to things she thought were important. "That was never all," she said. "No," he said, "it wasn't." They walked through the gate. The mechanism did what it always did. Quiet, reliable, indifferent to who was walking through it or what they were carrying or what the day had meant. The arms stayed up. The LED stayed green. On the other side, Lily reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the piece of quartz from the state park hike in December. She'd been carrying it for 4 months. He'd seen it on her dresser, in her backpack, on the kitchen counter. She held it up in the late April light, which caught in it and showed the crystal structure inside, the way the interior of a thing is different from its surface. "I've been thinking," she said, "that when I'm older I want to understand systems like you do. Not necessarily the same systems, but the way you think about them, from the inside out." He looked at her. "You already do." "Not as well." "Not yet," he said. "You will." She pocketed the quartz. They walked toward the car. The evening was the kind that April produces when it's decided to stop pretending it might still be winter. Genuinely warm at the edges, the light lasting longer than it had any right to this deep into the afternoon. The quality of air that makes you slow down slightly without deciding to. Around them, the parking lot was ordinary. Cars, asphalt, the ambient noise of a facility at the end of a working day, people heading home. Nothing remarkable. Ethan walked through it thinking about Hendrix and her daughter, about Torres in the sub-5 corridor, and Marcus at his console, and Diane Chen, who kept her copies, and Audrey Weston, who picked up the phone eventually, and Priya Delacroix, who found satisfaction in making records match reality, and James Okafor, who'd written one sentence in a cover letter about safety as a perspective rather than a specialty. He thought about what it actually takes to change a thing, not the dramatic version, not the single act or the revealed truth, or the moment where the bad actor is exposed and the record corrects itself in one clean movement, the real version, which is slower and messier and requires many people making many small choices over a long time, most of which go unwitnessed. The filing of reports that disappear into systems, the keeping of copies, the standing up when it costs something, the building of protocols and foundations where they might never be needed. The thing about systems, the thing he'd understood since he was young enough to start understanding it, is that they don't have intentions. They have logic. They do what they've been built to do, faithfully and without conscience, until someone builds a conscience into them. The conscience has to come from the people. It has to be installed deliberately, maintained carefully, and protected against the always present institutional tendency to convert it from automatic to optional. His whole career had been about that gap. The gap between what a system was documented to do and what it actually did. Between the safety that appeared in the policy memo and the safety that existed in the foundation. Between the story an organization told about itself and the reality running underneath it. Closing that gap wasn't glamorous work. It was the kind of work that got you walked out of buildings in front of your daughter on a gray October morning, and also the kind that kept people alive in sub-level corridors on November nights. And both of those things were the same work seen from different distances. He was going to keep doing it. Not because it was clean or finished or going to resolve into a state where he could stop. It wouldn't. Systems never stopped needing the people who understood them to keep paying attention. But because the alternative was the building with its doors locked, and the people underground and the monitor in the command center showing whatever version of reality the people in charge of the monitor had decided to display. He'd built a different version of reality into the foundation. And the foundation had held. Lily got to the car first and stood by the passenger door waiting for him to unlock it. Impatient in the mild way she was impatient about things that didn't matter much. Not irritated, just ready to be moving. He unlocked the car. She got in. He got in. He started the engine. "Tomatoes," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "For the garden. I've been thinking about it. We can do both. Tomatoes on the left side and herbs on the right. There's enough space." He considered the backyard in his mind, the dimensions, the light angles, the existing drainage. "We'll need to amend the soil on the left side. It drains too fast for tomatoes." "Okay, so we amend it." "That's more work than you think." "I know how much work it is. Mara's family does a garden. I helped them last spring." She looked at him. "I know what amending soil means, Dad." He pulled out of the parking space. "All right, tomatoes and herbs. And maybe something else on the far end. I haven't decided." "What are you thinking?" "Something that comes back every year," she said, without having to replant it. He drove toward the gate. The arm came up when they approached it, smooth, automatic, the hydraulic mechanism doing the thing it was designed to do without being asked twice. "Green light. Open." "Perennial," he said. "Is that what it's called?" "Something that comes back every year. It's called a perennial." She looked at the word like she was putting it somewhere. "Yeah," she said. "That. Something perennial." They drove through the gate and out into the April evening, and the building receded behind them in the rearview mirror, its dark glass face catching the last of the afternoon light and holding it for a moment before the road curved and there was only the evening ahead and all its ordinary, irreplaceable things.